My name is Lydia Hartman, and I am 32 years old. 2 weeks ago, I sat in the office of my family accountant, expecting to receive a check for $61,000. It was my share of my late grandfather's estate. It was the down payment for my first home. Instead of handing me a check, the accountant, a man who had known my family for 20 years, looked at me with a face drained of color. He pushed a wire transfer form across his desk. The form had my signature on the bottom line. It authorized the transfer of my entire inheritance into my older brother's commercial business account. I stared at the blue ink. I had not signed it. The accountant folded his hands and asked a question that made the floor drop out from under my chair. He asked me why my family had routed the money through my account without setting aside a single dollar for the taxes I now owed. My parents had not just stolen my future to bail out my brother, they had forged my name and left me with the bill. Before we get into exactly how I handled this, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Blueberry Revenge. If you have ever been the family safety net, the one expected to stay quiet while someone else gets the credit, drop a comment with your age, your location, and the local time. I read every single one to see where you are watching from. Now let me take you back to that Tuesday morning in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and the exact moment I realized my family viewed me as a disposable asset. The accounting office was on the second floor of a brick building off Route 70. It smelled like old paper and stale coffee. I work as a billing coordinator for a large dental group. My days are spent navigating insurance claims, patient ledgers, and exact diagnostic codes. I understand how paperwork moves. I understand what happens when numbers do not align. I had driven my 10-year-old Honda Civic to the appointment, carrying a clean manila envelope to hold my copy of the final estate disbursement. Tucked inside my purse was a printed real estate listing for a one-bedroom condo in a quiet river community along the Delaware. I had a viewing scheduled for the next afternoon. That money was my escape velocity. It was the only financial cushion I had ever been given. David Rossi walked into the conference room holding a thin gray folder. He is a man in his late 50s who usually greets me with a joke about the local sports teams or asks how the doctors at my clinic are treating me. That morning he did not smile. He did not offer me water. He sat across from me, opened the folder, and turned a single sheet of paper toward my side of the desk. I recognized the header immediately. It was a standard bank authorization form. Below the bank logo printed in bold letters, it read, "Gift authorization and wire transfer request." I scanned the lines. Transfer amount, $61,000. Date of execution, 3 weeks prior. Recipient account, Prestige Auto Detailing, LLC. That is my brother Connor's business. Connor is 34 years old. He leases a new Porsche every 2 years because he claims his clients need to see success before they trust him with their luxury vehicles. He wears designer watches and talks loudly at family dinners about his profit margins. But his shop is always quiet, and his margins always seem to require emergency cash injections from our parents. My eyes moved to the bottom of the page. The signature line. I looked at the blue ink. It was a very good attempt. The loop of the L and the sharp cross of the T were practiced. But it was not my hand. The pressure was wrong. The slant was too heavy. It was my father's handwriting carefully disguised to mimic mine. David cleared his throat. The sound was loud in the quiet room. He told me that my father Thomas had called the office a month ago. Thomas explained that the family had made a collective decision. Connor's business was facing a rough patch, and I had supposedly offered my inheritance to bridge the gap. My father told David not to bother me with the administrative details because I was busy at the clinic and he would handle the transfer paperwork on my behalf. David processed the forms because my father had managed my grandfather's estate and the signature appeared valid. But David is an accountant. His job is to look at the aftermath of a transaction. He leaned forward and steepled his fingers. He explained that because the estate payout was officially dispersed to my Social Security number before the wire transfer to Connor took place, the federal government viewed the initial $61,000 as my capital gain. The subsequent transfer to Connor was classified as a gift. David tapped his pen against the desk. He said that I now carried a $14,000 tax liability on money I had never touched. I did not scream. I did not cry. Crying is a luxury for people who have a safety net to catch them. My billing coordinator instincts took over calculating the damage with cold precision. $14,000 was 4 months of my take-home pay. If I did not pay the IRS, they would issue a notice of intent to levy. They would garnish my wages. I managed the financial intake for 5 dental partners. If a federal wage garnishment landed on the desk of my human resources director, my professional integrity would be questioned. My job would be at risk. My parents had not just emptied my bank account. They had tied a legal anchor to my career. I sat back in my chair and thought about the dinner my parents had hosted 4 days ago. They invited me to an upscale Italian restaurant in Morristown to celebrate the closing of the estate. Connor was there with his wife. They ordered calamari and an expensive bottle of Barolo wine. My father paid the check and raised his glass to me, telling the table how proud he was of my independence. He looked me in the eye and smiled. They were celebrating the heist. They were eating veal paid for by my stolen future, knowing they had forged my signature 3 weeks earlier to cover my brother's debts. David watched my face. He had reviewed enough family ledgers to recognize the look of someone discovering they had been betrayed. He lowered his voice, dropping the professional distance. He asked me directly if I had signed the authorization form. The moral trap closed around me. If I looked at David and said yes, I accepted a crushing federal tax debt that would destroy my savings and threaten my employment. If I said no, I was telling a licensed professional that my father had committed wire fraud and identity theft. In my family, loyalty to the golden child was the only rule that mattered. Exposing the theft meant exposing my parents to felony charges. I would be blamed for tearing the family apart. I would be the villain. I looked down at the forged ink. I thought about the 10 years I spent driving an old car, eating packed lunches, and covering my own bills so my parents could funnel their resources to Connor. I thought about the condo listing folded in my purse, a quiet place by the river that I had earned. I looked back at David. I did not blink. I told him I did not sign the form and I needed copies of every document in the file. I left the accounting office and drove straight back to the dental clinic. Tuesday afternoons are always loud. Phones ring constantly, hygienists move quickly between bays, and patients argue about copays at the front desk. Sarah, the clinic manager, was standing behind the reception counter looking at a denied claim from a major insurance carrier. A patient needed an emergency root canal and a crown, but the provider had rejected the pre-authorization based on a missing diagnostic code. Sarah rubbed her temples, looking stressed. I put my purse in my locker, clocked in, and took the file from her hands. I did not tell her I had just learned my family forged my signature on a federal document. I sat at my terminal, pulled the patient history cross, referenced the panoramic films, and found the exact narrative sequence the insurance adjuster needed. I typed the appeal, attached the digital x-rays, and submitted the correction in under 4 minutes. The approval generated instantly on the screen. Sarah touched my shoulder, smiled, and told me she did not know what the clinic would do without me. She said I was the only person who never let a detail slip through the cracks. Her praise landed in my chest like a cold weight. My professional life was built entirely on trust accuracy and paper trails that held up under strict scrutiny. Meanwhile, my own father had falsified a bank transfer because he knew I was too busy being responsible to double-check his work. At 6 o'clock, I walked out to the employee parking lot. My car is a 2012 Honda Civic. The silver paint on the hood is starting to peel, and the air conditioning takes 10 minutes to blow cold, but it has 140,000 miles on it, and it runs perfectly. I bought it used when I was 22. I have never missed an oil change. I have never had a car payment. I skipped summer vacations in my 20s, packed my lunch 4 days a week, and put every extra dollar into a high-yield savings account. I lived practically so I could eventually live securely. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine turned over with a familiar, rattling hum. I sat in the driver's seat and thought about my brother Connor. Connor drives a black Porsche Macan. He leases a new model every 2 years. When I asked him about the monthly payment at a family dinner last year, my mother interrupted to explain that a luxury auto detailing business requires strong optics. She said high-end clients will not hand over the keys to a six-figure sports car if the detailer drives a rusty sedan. Connor nodded, took a sip of wine my parents had paid for, and agreed that the lease was simply a marketing expense. His business optics were funded by my father borrowing against his retirement and now funded by the outright theft of my inheritance. Connor fails upward. He makes reckless financial bets, buys expensive watches to look successful, and waits for a safety net to catch him when the creditors call. I was the safety net. My family viewed my financial discipline not as a virtue to be respected, but as a resource to be harvested. I drove home to my apartment in a busy commuter suburb near Newark. It is a third-floor walk-up. The floorboards slant toward the windows, and the kitchen is so narrow the refrigerator door hits the oven handle if you open both at the same time. The carpet in the living room is a faded generic beige. I rent this place because it is cheap. I have lived here for 7 years, enduring noisy neighbors and rattling radiators, saving the difference between this rent and a nicer unit to build my down payment. When my parents visited last Christmas, my mother stood in the middle of my small living room and looked around with a tight, polite smile. She told my aunt on the phone later that evening that Lydia does not need much space. She said I was so low maintenance that a tiny apartment suited my personality perfectly. Low maintenance. That was the phrase my mother used to describe a daughter who never asked for a dime. They looked at my cramped apartment and did not see the sacrifices I was making to secure a better future. They saw a girl who could survive on very little. And because I could survive on very little, they decided I did not need the $61,000 my grandfather left me. They assumed I would simply absorb the loss, adjust my budget, and keep driving my old Honda. They thought I would quietly endure the financial hit so Connor could keep playing the successful entrepreneur and taking his wife to expensive dinners. I unlocked my door, walked into the narrow kitchen, and set my keys on the counter. I opened my purse and pulled out the manila envelope the accountant had given me. Next to it, I placed the printed real estate listing I had carried around for 3 weeks. It was a one-bedroom condo in a quiet river community along the Delaware. Corner unit, hardwood floors, a small balcony overlooking the water. It was listed at $280,000. My grandfather's payout was going to cover the 20% down payment with enough left over for closing costs and a fresh coat of paint. It was supposed to be the first thing I ever owned. The viewing was scheduled for tomorrow at 5:30 in the afternoon. I stared at the glossy photos of the kitchen island and the large windows letting in natural light. I had already mentally arranged my furniture in that living room. I picked up a black ballpoint pen from the counter. I pressed the tip of the pen against the paper right over the time of the appointment. I drew a thick, dark line through the numbers. Then I drew another. I crossed out my name. I crossed out the address. The physical act of dragging the ink across the page felt like carving a groove into my own skin. The condo was gone. The balcony was gone. The quiet mornings by the river were gone. They had evaporated 3 weeks ago in a fraudulent bank transfer I never authorized. I sat at my small kitchen table and looked at the forged signature on the copy of the wire form. The reality of what my parents had done settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. My entire identity within the family was built on being the responsible, quiet one. I was the daughter who fixed the computer router, who picked up the cake for family birthdays, who sat in the corner and never raised her voice when conversations grew tense. I kept the peace. My parents relied on that peace. They relied on my aversion to conflict to shield them from consequence. They looked at my careful life weighted against Connor's failing business and made a cold, calculated choice. They decided that Connor's comfort was worth more than my future. They bet that my habit of staying quiet would hold true even when a $14,000 tax liability was dropped on my shoulders. I put the pen down. I looked around my cramped, faded living room. I did not shed a single tear. The initial shock had already burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear focus. I folded the copy of the forged wire transfer and placed it back into the manila envelope. I picked up my keys from the counter. I locked the door to my apartment, walked down the 3 flights of stairs, and got back into my old car. I did not drive toward the river. I put my car in gear and set my route for my parents' house in the suburbs. It was time to show them what happens when the quiet daughter finally decides to speak. The drive from my apartment to my parents' house in Somerset County takes 35 minutes. The transition between the two towns is stark. The congested highways yield to quiet tree-lined roads, wide asphalt driveways, and two-story colonial homes sitting on meticulously manicured half-acre lots. My parents bought their house 20 years ago. It has a wraparound porch, a 3-car garage, and a lawn kept perfectly green by a professional landscaping service they pay every Tuesday afternoon. I pulled my faded sedan into the driveway. I parked it next to my father's late-model SUV and Connor's black Porsche. The luxury car gleamed under the motion sensor floodlights. The tires were coated in high-gloss shine, and the leather seats were pristine. My grandfather's estate money bought that shine. I walked up the brick path and used the spare key I have carried on my ring since college. The front door is heavy, solid oak. I pushed it open and stepped into the foyer. The house smelled of toasted sesame expensive ginger and the faint floral notes of my mother's signature perfume. I could hear them before I reached the kitchen. I heard the sound of casual laughter. I heard the clink of heavy silverware against porcelain plates. I heard the distinct sound of wine being poured into crystal glasses. It was a random Tuesday night, but they sounded like a family celebrating a holiday. They sounded safe, comfortable, and entirely unbothered by the federal crime sitting in their recent history. I walked down the hallway and stood in the doorway. The kitchen is the centerpiece of my parents' house. It features custom cherry cabinets, stainless steel appliances, and a wide granite island taking up the center of the room. Helen. My mother was standing near the stove, pouring a dark red wine from an expensive bottle. Thomas, my father, leaned against the counter near the refrigerator holding a cloth napkin. Connor and his wife Jessica sat on the high leather bar stools at the island. Between them sat a wooden boat filled with high-end takeout sushi. There were thick slices of fatty tuna, fresh yellowtail salmon, and delicate rolls topped with bright orange caviar. It was the kind of dinner that costs $200 just for the appetizers. Jessica wore a silk blouse, her wrist heavy with a gold bracelet Connor had bought her for their anniversary last month. No one noticed me for a few seconds. Connor picked up a piece of spicy tuna with his wooden chopsticks. He dipped it into a shallow dish of dark soy sauce. I walked over to the granite island. I reached into my manila envelope, pulled out the copy of the forged wire transfer, and dropped it flat on the counter. It landed right next to Connor's soy sauce dish with a sharp slap of paper against stone. The laughter stopped. Helen lowered the wine bottle. Thomas straightened his posture, tossing his cloth napkin onto the counter. Connor did not flinch. He glanced down at the paper, then popped the spicy tuna roll into his mouth and chewed slowly. He looked bored. He looked like a man waiting for a commercial break to end so his television show could resume. He did not look like a man whose sister had just caught him stealing her future to fund his lifestyle. I looked directly at my father. I asked him why my signature was on a document I had never seen. Thomas cleared his throat. He did not look ashamed. He looked irritated, acting like a busy manager dealing with an employee asking unnecessary questions. He crossed his arms and let out a long, heavy breath. He said the bank deadline was tight. The commercial lender needed the capital injection cleared by the end of the month to keep Connor's business accounts active. Thomas explained that driving the paperwork to my clinic would have taken too long. Since the family had already agreed to help Connor through a rough patch, signing my name was just an administrative shortcut. He called a federal felony an administrative shortcut. He said it with the casual confidence of a man who has spent 30 years erasing his son's mistakes. When Connor wrecked a neighbor's fence in high school, Thomas paid cash to keep the police out of it. When Connor dropped out of an expensive business seminar, Thomas covered the tuition penalty so Connor would not face the consequences. Now, when Connor needed $61,000 to prop up a failing detailing shop, Thomas simply took my inheritance and signed my name. Helen set the wine bottle down hard enough to make a dull thud against the counter. She stepped in, defaulting to her usual tactic of shifting the blame onto the person asking questions. She scolded me for walking into her house and ruining a peaceful family dinner. She insisted they were going to tell me about the transfer over the upcoming weekend. She raised her voice slightly, asking if I was really going to tear this family apart over some paperwork. That was the moral trap. I was supposed to back down. I was supposed to apologize for making them feel uncomfortable about robbing me. I was supposed to value the quiet aesthetic of their sushi dinner more than I valued my own financial survival. I did not back down. I told them the money was for my condo down payment. I told them David Rossi had informed me about the $14,000 tax liability sitting firmly on my shoulders. I expected a flash of shock. I expected them to realize they had made a terrible mistake. Instead, Thomas rolled his eyes. He stepped closer to the island, placing his hands flat on the cold granite. He looked at me with dismissive authority. He sighed and delivered the line that severed whatever remaining loyalty I held for him. He said, "Connor is under enough pressure already. You just rent Lydia. Connor has a business and a wife to support. You do not need the cash right now." I turned my head to look at Connor. He was reaching for another roll with his chopsticks. He did not look guilty. He did not look burdened by any unseen pressure. He looked entirely detached from the destruction of my life. He chewed his food, his eyes focused on the television playing a sports game in the adjacent family room. He fully expected his parents to handle his annoying sister. He expected them to manage my reaction smooth over my anger and send me back to my cramped apartment so he could finish his expensive dinner in peace. Jessica took a slow sip of her wine, inspecting her manicured nails, acting as if the conversation happening 2 feet away had nothing to do with her designer clothing or her luxury car. I turned back to Thomas. I told him the Internal Revenue Service does not care that I just rent. I explained that a $14,000 tax bill means the federal government will issue a notice of intent to levy. I told him my paycheck would be garnished. My job at the dental clinic requires managing patient funds and balancing daily financial ledgers. Having my wages garnished for tax evasion is a major compliance violation. It is a fireable offense. Helen waved her hand in the air, a quick flick of her wrist, meant to brush away my reality. She said I was being overly dramatic. She took a sip of her red wine and promised they would figure out the tax issue when things settled down, and Connor's business turned a profit next quarter. They had no plan to pay the taxes. They had no plan to return the $61,000. They had sacrificed my financial security, my clean record, and my career stability to buy Connor a few more months of pretending to be a successful business owner. They expected me to nod to accept the heavy burden of their choices and to say the words they had trained me to say my entire life. They waited for me to tell them it was okay. The kitchen went silent. The only sound was the low murmur of the television in the other room and the soft clink of Connor setting his chopsticks against a ceramic plate. My father watched me, his arms crossed, waiting for my compliance. My mother held her wine glass, her lips pressed into a thin line, daring me to push the argument further. I looked at the forged document sitting on the granite. I reached out and picked it up. I folded the paper in half and slid it back into my manila envelope. I did not yell. I did not flip the sushi boat off the island. I looked at my father, then at my mother, and finally at my brother, who refused to meet my gaze. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I walked down the hall, opened the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the cool New Jersey night air. I left them in silence. I refused to give them the absolution they demanded. I got into my old car and drove away from the manicured lawn and the gleaming Porsche, knowing my quiet life was over, and the real damage was just beginning to surface. It had been exactly 7 days since I walked out of my parents' kitchen and left them sitting with their expensive sushi. A week of total silence followed. My phone did not ring. No text messages arrived asking if I was all right or offering a genuine explanation. They assumed the storm had passed because I had retreated to my apartment. In their minds, my quiet departure was a sign of submission. They believed I had gone home to lick my wounds, adjust my budget, and accept the reality they had forced upon me. I threw myself into my work at the dental clinic. The clinic was the one place where I had total control. I manage hundreds of thousands of dollars in patient billing insurance payouts and vendor invoices every month. I balance the daily ledgers to the penny. My desk is organized, my patient files are flawless, and my reputation among the partners is bulletproof. My professional integrity was my armor against a family that treated me like an afterthought, or at least it was. Thursday morning started like any other busy day in the office. The waiting room was full, the phones were ringing, and the faint, high-pitched whine of dental drills echoed from the treatment bays. I was standing at the front desk processing a complex coordination of benefits for a patient needing oral surgery. Sarah, the clinic manager, walked out of the administrative hallway. She did not have her usual morning coffee in her hand. Her posture was rigid. She was holding a stiff white envelope with a bright green certified mail sticker across the top edge. She stopped a few feet from my desk. She looked at me, then glanced nervously at the waiting room full of patients reading magazines. She asked me to step into her office and close the door behind me. The administrative office is a small, windowless room filled with filing cabinets and the low hum of an air purifier. Sarah sat down behind her desk and placed the certified letter flat on the blotter. She did not offer me a seat. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen her wear before. It was a mixture of sympathy and deep, cautious suspicion. She took a slow breath and explained that the clinic uses a third-party compliance and payroll agency to monitor employees who handle large sums of medical payments. The agency runs automated background and financial monitoring to protect the practice against embezzlement or corporate fraud. Sarah tapped her index finger against the heavy paper of the certified letter. She told me the compliance agency had sent an urgent alert regarding a severe unverified anomaly linked directly to my Social Security number. The automated system had flagged a sudden transfer of $61,000, immediately followed by a federal tax delinquency alert. My cheeks burned. A hot, prickly wave of humiliation crawled up my neck and spread across my face. I stared at the official corporate letterhead sitting on her desk. The paper looked heavy and unforgiving. The numbers printed on that page represented the theft of my grandfather's estate, but to the compliance agency, they looked like the footprint of a thief. I was the financial coordinator for a lucrative medical practice, and my personal record was suddenly flashing warning signs of severe financial instability. Sarah folded her hands together. She told me she knew I was a dedicated employee. She praised my punctuality and my flawless bookkeeping over the years. But then she shifted her tone, adopting the sterile, protective voice of corporate management. She delivered a line that felt like a physical blow to my ribs. She said, "We just have to be careful with optics, Lydia. A flagged Social Security number for our billing coordinator is a red flag we cannot ignore. Optics." The word echoed in the small office. It was the exact same word my mother used to justify Connor leasing a luxury Porsche. My brother needed a $90,000 sports car for his business optics, and my parents had stolen my future to fund that illusion. Now that same concept was being weaponized against me in the real world. Connor was cruising down the highway in a detailed vehicle with leather seats, enjoying the unearned rewards of my stolen inheritance. My parents were sitting comfortably in their large suburban home, assuming my problems were my own business, and that my quiet resilience would shield them from any fallout. Meanwhile, I was standing in a windowless room, feeling my decade-long, spotless reputation burn to ash. I sat in the chair across from my boss, trying desperately to find the words to defend myself. How do you explain to a corporate manager that your own father forged a bank document to funnel money to your golden child brother? The moral trap clamped shut around my throat. If I told Sarah the unvarnished truth, I sounded like a dramatic liability. Corporate clinics do not want employees entangled in messy criminal family disputes. Telling my boss that my family committed wire fraud would only make me look volatile and surrounded by chaos. But if I stayed silent and offered no explanation, I looked like a legitimate financial risk. I looked like an employee hiding a sudden illicit windfall or actively evading federal taxes. My family had cornered me. They knew I valued my independence and my career above everything else. They banked on the idea that I would swallow the tax debt to avoid making a scene. They never considered that federal algorithms and compliance agencies do not care about family loyalty. Thomas called his forgery an administrative shortcut, But that shortcut had triggered a system that was now threatening my ability to pay my rent. Sarah leaned forward, her expression tightening into a professional boundary. She gently suggested that I needed to step away from handling patient payments, insurance checks, and daily deposits until this personal financial discrepancy was cleared up. She framed it as a temporary measure, a corporate protocol to protect the clinic until I resolve my issues. She asked me to hand over my administrative access card and my secure login token. My hands shook as I reached into my pocket. I unclipped the plastic badge I had earned through years of reliable, tedious work. I set it on her desk next to the certified letter. Sarah told me I would be reassigned to answering phones and organizing paper charts in the back filing room. I was being demoted in my own workplace because my father had decided my brother's comfort was more valuable than my livelihood. I walked out of the manager's office and returned to the front desk. I had to log out of the financial software I had managed perfectly for years. I stood aside and watched a junior receptionist, a girl I had trained just 3 months ago, take over my terminal and begin processing the payments I was no longer trusted to touch. The hygienists walked past the desk, casting curious glances at my sudden reassignment. The humiliation was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my shoulders. I kept my face blank, forcing a polite smile for the patients signing in at the desk, while my mind raced through the wreckage of my life. My family had not just stolen my savings, they had breached the walls of my sanctuary. They were actively destroying my income, my professional standing, and my dignity. Surviving quietly was no longer an option. If I did not fight back, I would lose my job, my apartment, and the independent life I had spent a decade building. I could not rely on my parents to fix this. They had already proven they would watch me drown if it meant keeping Connor's boat afloat. I had to clear my name with the federal government and my employer, and I knew exactly who held the paper trail I needed to start defending myself. The weekend arrived with a heavy, suffocating dread. I had spent the last 2 days at the dental clinic filing paper charts in the back room, stripped of my financial clearance, watching a junior receptionist do the job I had perfected over a decade. My boss treated me with polite caution. My co-workers traded confused glances every time I walked past the front desk. My professional life was hanging by a thread, and my bank account was still empty. But in my family, personal ruin does not excuse you from social obligations. Sunday afternoon was my cousin Emily's bridal shower. Emily is the daughter of my mother's older sister, Aunt Marie. Skipping the shower was not an option. In a family that values optics over honesty, an unexplained absence is treated as an admission of guilt. I knew I had to walk into that banquet hall, smile, and pretend my life was not falling apart. The shower was held at a golf club in Morristown. The parking lot was filled with luxury SUVs and polished sedans. I parked my faded Honda Civic near the back, near the dumpsters, and pulled my gift from the trunk. I had purchased a high-end cast-iron Dutch oven for Emily weeks ago, before my grandfather's estate money was stolen. It was a thoughtful, practical gift, wrapped in heavy silver paper with a white satin ribbon. I carried the heavy box across the lot and walked through the double doors of the banquet room. The room smelled of catered salmon, fresh lilies, and champagne. About 40 women were gathered around circular tables covered in pastel pink linens. The sound of clinking glasses and overlapping conversations echoed off the high ceilings. I walked toward the gift table in the corner to drop off my box. Aunt Marie was standing there organizing the presents. Aunt Marie shares my mother's obsession with appearances. She has always judged my choices frequently, offering unsolicited advice about how a woman in her 30s should focus on finding a husband rather than working a desk job. I smiled politely and placed my silver box near the center of the table. Aunt Marie did not smile back. She looked at me with a tight, disapproving expression. Without saying a word, she placed her hands on my silver box and shoved it hard toward the back edge of the table, nearly knocking it onto the floor. She moved it to make room for an enormous, towering package wrapped in gold foil. The gift tag on the gold box was signed by Connor and Jessica. My brother, who was drowning in commercial debt and driving a leased Porsche funded by my stolen inheritance, had purchased the largest gift in the room. Aunt Marie smoothed the gold ribbon with reverence, treating Connor's display of fake wealth like royalty while treating my genuine sacrifice like clutter. I turned away from the gift table and walked toward the beverage station. The atmosphere in the room felt thick. It was an ice-cold current moving beneath the polite surface. As I approached a group of my cousins, their laughter stopped abruptly. 3 of them turned their backs to me, pretending to admire the floral arrangements. I walked past my mother's friends from the local township committee. The women lowered their voices, their eyes tracking my movements. The whisper network was fully operational. I could hear the faint clinking of ice against crystal flutes, the rustle of expensive fabrics, and the sharp, deliberate silence that followed me across the carpet. I poured myself a glass of water and stood near the edge of the patio doors, physically isolated from the rest of the room. My family was treating me like a pariah. I had grown up in this community. I had babysat these cousins. I had helped Aunt Marie organize her own anniversary party 5 years ago, staying late to clean up the rented hall while the rest of the family went home to sleep. Now I was standing alone, exiled in plain sight. Aunt Marie broke from the crowd and marched directly toward me. Her posture was rigid, her chin tilted upward in an expression of deep moral superiority. She cornered me against the glass patio doors, ensuring no one else was close enough to interrupt. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask about my job. She leaned in, smelling of strong perfume and champagne, and told me I should be ashamed of myself. She kept her voice low, a harsh hissing whisper meant to cut deep. She told me Emily's bridal shower was a day for family joy, and my presence was casting a dark cloud over the event. I stared at her, genuinely confused, asking her what she meant. Aunt Marie scoffed. She accused me of demanding a handout from my struggling brother. She said it was disgusting that a single woman with no real responsibilities would try to squeeze money out of a young man trying to keep his small business afloat and provide for his wife. The ground shifted beneath my feet as the twisted narrative took shape. Helen had not stayed silent during the week I spent exiled in the back filing room of the clinic. My mother had gone on a preemptive strike. She had spun a masterful, devastating lie. Helen told the extended family that the $61,000 from my grandfather had always been intended for Connor's business. She painted a picture where Connor was the hardworking entrepreneur bravely fighting through a tough economy, and I was the bitter, jealous spinster sister who felt entitled to a cut of his hard-earned cash. She had twisted the theft of my inheritance into a story of my own greed. Aunt Marie looked at me with pure disgust. She told me I needed to grow up, stop throwing tantrums over family money, and learn to support the people who were actually building a legacy. My chest tightened. The injustice was a physical pressure against my lungs. My parents had stolen my future, forged my signature on a federal document, and triggered an investigation that was currently threatening my career. And instead of feeling an ounce of guilt, my mother had spent the week convincing our entire extended family that I was a predator. Connor was enjoying complete immunity from judgment, praised for a large gold box he likely paid for with a credit card he could not afford, while I was being scolded for wanting my own stolen money back. The moral trap closed its jaws around me. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to defend myself. I wanted to yell. I wanted to tell Aunt Marie that her beloved nephew was a fraud who was sinking under commercial debt. I wanted to announce to the banquet room that my father was a felon who forged bank transfers. But I looked around the room. I saw 40 women holding champagne flutes, all dressed in pastel colors, all watching me out of the corners of their eyes. If I raised my voice, I would confirm every lie Helen had planted. If I caused a scene at a bridal shower, I would instantly become the unstable, dramatic, selfish woman they already believed me to be. The burden of proof is always placed on the quiet one who finally snaps. I swallowed the anger. I kept my face entirely blank, forcing my breathing to remain steady. I did not give Aunt Marie the reaction she wanted. I simply stared at her until she grew uncomfortable and took a half-step back. Just then, my mother glided across the carpet. Helen looked radiant. She wore a tailored navy dress holding a mimosa, playing the role of the gracious, successful matriarch. She stopped next to Aunt Marie, placed a gentle hand on her sister's arm, and smiled a sad, patient smile. Helen acted like a mother managing a difficult, unruly child in public. She thanked Marie for trying to talk sense into me. Marie nodded stiffly and walked away to rejoin the other guests. Helen stepped closer to me. The gracious smile remained fixed on her face for the benefit of the watching room, but her eyes were cold, calculating, and victorious. She leaned in close, her lips brushing near my ear. She whispered the cruel pressure line that was meant to break my spirit. "See, everyone agrees. Just drop the money thing and stop embarrassing yourself." She pulled back, took a delicate sip of her mimosa, and patted my shoulder. She turned and walked back into the crowd, immediately surrounded by a group of laughing cousins. She had orchestrated the entire room. She had weaponized social pressure to force my submission. My parents believed that if they made the social cost of fighting back too high, I would eventually fold. They thought the fear of being outcast by the extended family would compel me to accept the tax debt and the loss of my inheritance in silence. I stood by the patio doors, looking at the women laughing and celebrating around the gift table. I realized in that exact moment that the truth held no power in this room. These people did not want the truth. They wanted the comfortable illusion my mother was selling. They wanted the handsome golden child with the expensive gifts, and they needed a villain to blame when the cracks in the facade started to show. My words would never be enough to counter my mother's practiced theatrical lies. I could not win a war of reputation using logic and defense. I needed leverage. I needed undeniable, cold, hard documentation that could not be spun or dismissed as the ramblings of a jealous sister. I set my half-empty water glass down on a nearby tray. I did not say goodbye to Emily. I did not say goodbye to my mother. I walked out of the banquet hall, crossed the parking lot to my faded Honda, and sat behind the wheel. I took out my phone and found the number for David Rossi, the accountant. The truth was not enough, but a federal paper trail was a different story entirely. Monday morning arrived with a gray, overcast sky and the heavy humidity typical of late spring in New Jersey. I did not go to the dental clinic. I called my manager, Sarah, and requested a personal day. Instead of standing in the back filing room organizing paper charts while my coworkers whispered about my sudden demotion, I drove my faded Honda back down Route 70 toward Cherry Hill. The bridal shower had taught me a brutal lesson. The truth holds zero currency against a well-rehearsed family lie. My mother had successfully painted me as a greedy, jealous sister to our entire extended family, using social pressure to isolate me. If I wanted to survive this, I could not fight a war of reputation. I needed undeniable leverage. I needed a paper shield. I needed an official affidavit of suspected identity theft to hand to the clinic compliance agency, proving the $14,000 tax liability was the result of fraud committed against me, not by me. David Rossi was waiting for me. I had called his accounting office the moment I left the golf club parking lot the day before. When I walked into his suite, the atmosphere was different than my first visit. David looked tired. He wore a crisp dress shirt but had discarded his tie and the sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. He felt responsible for processing the wire transfer that had drained my inheritance. He had trusted my father, a man he had done business with for 2 decades, and that trust had facilitated the theft of my future. David directed me to the chair across from his wide oak desk. He told me he was prepared to draft whatever documentation I needed to clear my name with my employer. The office was quiet. The only sounds were the low, steady hum of the desktop computer tower on the floor and the sharp, rhythmic clicking of David striking the keys on his keyboard. He pulled up my file on his monitor to gather the exact timestamps, the routing numbers, and the destination account details required for the sworn affidavit. I sat still, watching the dust motes drift in the beam of light, cutting through the window blinds. I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. I was shifting from a victim paralyzed by family gossip into someone actively building a defense. I was taking control of the narrative using the one language I understood perfectly: paperwork. David clicked his mouse a few times, navigating deeper into the bank trace attached to the original $61,000 wire transfer. He needed to verify the receiving institution for the affidavit. The steady clicking of his keyboard suddenly stopped. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the comfortable silence of a professional doing routine work. It was the sharp, dense silence of someone who has just noticed a crack in a foundation. I watched David lean closer to his monitor. He took his reading glasses off, wiped the lenses with a microfiber cloth from his desk drawer, put them back on, and stared at the screen. His brow furrowed. He moved his mouse again, opening a new tab. He hit a key to send a document to the laser printer sitting on a small table in the corner of his office. The machine whirred to life, pulling a fresh sheet of paper through its rollers. The warm paper slid onto the output tray. David stood up, retrieved the document, and walked back to his desk. He did not sit down. He remained standing, holding the paper in his hands, reading the printed text, as if trying to decipher a foreign language. He lowered the paper and looked at me. His face had gone pale. He placed the single sheet of paper face up on the edge of the desk and rotated it so I could read it. It was a secondary commercial credit report attached to my Social Security number. At the top of the page, printed in bold, sharp corporate lettering, was an imposing logo: Apex Commercial Lending. I stared at the logo. I had never heard of Apex Commercial Lending. I rent a slanted third-floor apartment and drive a 10-year-old car. I pay for my groceries with a debit card, and I do not carry a balance on my only credit card. My financial footprint is small, cautious, and incredibly clean. David rested his fingertips on the edge of the desk. He asked me why there was a hard pull on my credit from a commercial lending institution. The question hung in the air. A hard pull on a credit report only happens when an individual formally applies for a substantial loan or line of credit. I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. I told him I had not applied for any loans. I had never spoken to anyone at Apex Commercial Lending. David sat down heavily in his leather chair. He rubbed his hand over his chin. He turned his computer monitor slightly so I could see the screen. He pointed to the digital trace of the wire transfer my father had forged. He explained that the $61,000 was not just a simple cash dump to help my brother pay his rent or cover a few slow weeks at the auto detailing shop. The bank coding on the transfer was highly specific. The money had been routed into a holding account and flagged as a capital injection. I am a billing coordinator. I know what an injection of capital signifies in a corporate setting. David spelled it out for me, translating the financial data into a reality that made the blood freeze in my veins. Connor was drowning. His luxury auto detailing business was failing, and he needed a massive commercial loan to stay afloat, buy new equipment, or consolidate his mounting debts. But commercial banks do not lend large sums of money to a failing business owner with a history of missed payments and a leased Porsche he cannot afford. The bank required two things to approve the loan. They required a significant cash deposit to prove the business had liquidity. That was the stolen $61,000 from my grandfather. And they required a legal guarantor with a flawless financial record to secure the debt in case the business defaulted. I have an 800 credit score. I built that score by skipping vacations wearing cheap clothes and tracking every single dollar I earned since I was 18 years old. My pristine credit was the armor I built to protect myself from the financial chaos my parents constantly bailed Connor out of. My brother and my parents had looked at my armor and decided it belonged to them. The golden child did not just want my cash. He looked at my spotless financial identity and treated it as his own personal blank check. He believed my discipline was just another asset for him to exploit, and my parents had enabled him. They had reasoned that since I lived a quiet, low-maintenance life, I would never run a commercial credit check on myself. They thought what I did not know would not hurt me. They assumed I would just keep going to work, paying my rent, and living in the shadows, while my perfect credit score propped up the illusion of Connor's success. A cold, rising dread expanded in my chest. The air in the accounting office suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The stolen inheritance was not the end of the betrayal. It was merely the doorway. The $61,000 was just the entry fee my family paid to unlock a much larger vault using my name. David looked at me with deep, profound pity. It is a terrible thing to be pitied by a man who handles numbers for a living, because numbers do not lie, and his numbers were telling him that my life was in grave danger. He leaned across the desk and delivered a line that shattered the last remaining fragment of denial I was clinging to. Lydia, they did not just take your cash. They used your name for something else. The cruelty of that realization hit me with physical force. They had tethered me to a sinking ship. But David was a cautious man, and he understood the legal cliff we were standing on. He warned me about the moral trap I was currently facing. If we dug deeper into the Apex commercial lending file, we would no longer be dealing with a simple family dispute over a misdirected inheritance. We would be uncovering federal commercial bank fraud. If we pulled this thread and obtained the loan origination documents, we would cross a point of no return. We would find the exact paperwork my father used to bind me to Connor's business. Exposing that paperwork would not just ruin Connor's detailing shop, it would send my parents to federal prison. David asked me if I was prepared to open that door. He told me that once the commercial lender was alerted to a fraudulent guarantor, the fallout would be catastrophic and unstoppable. I looked at the imposing Apex logo printed on the paper in front of me. I thought about my mother standing at the bridal shower, smiling her gracious practiced smile, while she told our entire extended family that I was a greedy, jealous daughter trying to ruin my brother. She had stood in a room full of people and confidently destroyed my reputation, knowing full well that she and my father had secretly chained my financial future to Connor's impending bankruptcy. They had set me on fire to keep their golden child warm, and then complained about the smoke. I thought about the years of quiet obedience. I thought about the dental clinic where my boss was currently treating me like a liability. I thought about the condo by the river I would never get to buy. My parents had relied on my silence. They had banked their entire criminal enterprise on the assumption that I would lack the stomach to fight back. They believed my fear of destroying the family would force me to accept whatever ruin they handed me. I looked David directly in the eyes. I did not hesitate. The terrified victim who had walked into his office 30 minutes ago was gone. In her place was a woman who had nothing left to lose. I told David to pull the records. I told him I needed to know exactly what they had signed me up for. I needed to see the paperwork, no matter whose forged signature was at the bottom of the page. I walked out of David Rossi's office holding a single piece of paper that held the power to either save my career or destroy my family. It was a sworn identity theft affidavit. The document carried a raised notary seal and a stark red stamp from the accounting firm indicating it was an official filing bound for the federal tax authorities. The paper felt heavy in my hand. It was the physical manifestation of a boundary. For 32 years, I had absorbed the weight of my parents' decisions, quietly bending my own life to accommodate the wide, destructive wake left by my brother. That compliance ended the moment my boss asked me to surrender my security badge. I drove to the dental clinic early the next morning. The sun was barely rising over the New Jersey Turnpike, casting a pale, washed-out light across the strip malls and commuter lots. I parked my faded sedan in the employee section. My stomach was a tight knot of nervous energy. For the past several days, I had been exiled to a windowless storage room in the back of the building. I had spent my shifts organizing color-coded paper charts and scanning old patient intakes stripped of all financial clearance. I had watched a junior receptionist, a girl fresh out of a community college training program, stumble through the complex billing software I had mastered years ago. Every time a coworker walked past the storage room, I felt their lingering gaze. They did not know the details, but they knew I had been flagged by corporate compliance. In a medical office, losing financial clearance is a stain that rarely washes out. I had spent 10 years building a reputation as the most reliable, fastidious coordinator in the regional network. My family had jeopardized a decade of flawless work in a matter of seconds. I walked through the sliding glass doors before the first patient arrived. The waiting room was empty, smelling faintly of citrus air freshener and sterile wipes. I bypassed the front desk and walked straight down the administrative corridor. Sarah was already in her office sipping from a paper coffee cup and reviewing the daily schedule on her monitor. She looked up when I knocked on the open door. Her expression immediately shifted into that same cautious, guarded neutrality she had worn when she handed me the certified compliance warning. She braced herself, likely expecting me to offer a tearful resignation or a complicated, dramatic excuse for the financial anomaly. I stepped into the room and closed the door behind me. The click of the latch sealed us in the quiet space. I did not offer a long prelude. I did not cry. I approached her desk and placed the sworn identity theft affidavit flat on the center of her desk blotter. I told her the sudden transfer and the resulting tax delinquency flagged by the compliance agency were the result of a federal crime committed against me. I kept my voice level and professional, using the exact tone I use when explaining a denied claim to an uncooperative insurance adjuster. I told Sarah I had filed an official report with my certified public accountant, and the document in front of her was proof that my Social Security number had been compromised without my consent. Sarah set her coffee cup down. She leaned forward and read the document. I watched her eyes track back and forth across the typed paragraphs. I had to expose the criminality of my own flesh and blood to my employer just to maintain my livelihood. The affidavit clearly stated that the unauthorized transfer was executed from an external IP address, bypassing my personal security protocols, and that the signature was a confirmed forgery. It outlined my status as a victim of financial fraud. The silence in the office stretched out heavy and thick. I stood there, risking my family's freedom to save my own ability to pay rent. When Sarah reached the bottom of the page and saw the raised notary seal, her posture changed. The rigid corporate tension melted from her shoulders. She exhaled a long, deep breath that ruffled the edge of the paper. She looked up at me, and the guarded suspicion in her eyes was replaced by a profound, genuine relief. She was a manager who relied on my competence, and she had hated losing her best coordinator. But beneath the professional relief, another emotion surfaced. She realized what the affidavit implied. She realized that someone close enough to access my personal inheritance data had orchestrated this theft. She did not pry into the family dynamics. She did not ask for the name of the perpetrator. She simply looked at me with deep sympathy and told me she was so sorry I had to go through something so awful. Sarah opened the top drawer of her desk. She reached inside and pulled out the blue plastic security badge with my photo printed on the front. It was the same badge I had surrendered days earlier. She handed it across the desk. I took the badge. The smooth plastic felt cool against my palm. I clipped it onto my lanyard, listening to the satisfying snap of the fastener. It was a small, ordinary sound, but it echoed like a gavel striking a block. Sarah told me she would fax a copy of the affidavit to the corporate compliance department immediately to clear the red flag from my employee profile. She told me to log back into my terminal and resume my normal duties. I had reclaimed my professional identity. I had secured my income. I had drawn a line in the sand, and it had held. I walked out of the manager office and stepped into the employee break room. The space was empty. I leaned against the counter, pulled my phone from my pocket, and opened a blank text message. The moral trap of my situation was glaring. By filing that affidavit and handing it to a corporate entity, I had officially placed a federal flag on my parents' home network. I had initiated a paper trail that pointed directly at the IP address Thomas used to forge the wire transfer. I had always been taught that protecting the family was the ultimate duty regardless of the cost to myself. For a fraction of a second, the old guilt flared in my chest. Then I thought about Connor eating expensive sushi while my boss questioned my integrity. I thought about my mother smiling at the bridal shower, convincing my aunts that I was a greedy predator. The guilt vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I typed a message to my father. I kept it brief, factual, and devoid of any emotional pleading. I wrote that the bank and my boss now know the signature on the wire transfer was forged. I told him my job is safe. I hit send. I watched the screen. I knew Thomas would be sitting in his spacious suburban kitchen, drinking his morning coffee, likely reading the sports section on his tablet. I pictured the moment the notification banner appeared on his screen. I watched the 3 gray typing bubbles appear, disappear, and reappear. He was calculating his response. He was scrambling to figure out how to manage the daughter who was no longer following the script. My phone buzzed. The reply was a single devastating text. Thomas wrote, "How could you do this to us? I thought you cared about your brother." I stared at the glowing screen. The text was a masterpiece of narcissistic deflection. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask if the threat of wage garnishment had been lifted. He did not express a single ounce of relief that his daughter had saved her career. He was only panicked that he might get caught. He was terrified that the protective bubble he had built around his golden child was about to burst, and he framed my survival as an attack on his family. He accused me of doing this to them when all I had done was hold up a mirror to the crime they had committed against me. I knew Connor was safely absent from this exchange. My brother was staying out of the crossfire, hiding behind our parents while they took the heat. Connor expected Thomas and Helen to absorb the friction, handle the messy fallout, and ensure his stolen funds remained untouched. My parents were eager participants in this dynamic, guilt-tripping me for simply defending my own livelihood. They expected me to fall on the sword, so Connor would not have to face the consequences of his failing business. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I did not reply to his message. The silence would torture him far more than any argument I could type. I walked out of the break room and took my seat at the front reception desk. I logged into the billing software, my fingers flying across the keyboard with familiar muscle memory. The dental clinic began to fill with patients, and the steady rhythm of my workday resumed. I felt a surge of empowerment. I had faced the immediate threat and won a small, vital victory. I had forced my family to realize I was no longer a silent resource waiting to be mined. But as I processed the morning insurance claims, a dark shadow lingered at the edge of my thoughts. The affidavit had stopped the tax garnishment and cleared my name at work, but it did nothing to explain the terrifying discovery in David Rossi's office. The hard pull from Apex Commercial Lending was still sitting on my credit report. I had won the morning skirmish, but the heavy, imposing logo of that commercial bank was a ticking clock, and I knew the real war had not even begun. 2 full weeks passed without a single word from my family. The silence was profound. In the past, whenever I caused a ripple of discomfort, my mother would barrage me with guilt-inducing text messages until I apologized for upsetting her. She would demand that I come over for dinner to smooth things over. This time my phone remained entirely still. No missed calls from my father. No passive-aggressive social media updates from Connor. I interpreted their silence as a surrender. I believed my text message to my father had worked. I thought that exposing the forgery to my employer and halting the tax garnishment had forced them to realize I was no longer an easy target. They knew the federal government was involved, and I assumed that fear had driven them into hiding. I returned to my normal routine at the dental clinic. I managed the daily ledgers, greeted the patients, and enjoyed the restored trust of my manager, Sarah. The $14,000 tax liability was frozen while the identity theft investigation proceeded. For 14 days, I allowed myself to breathe. I walked through the grocery store without checking my bank application in a panic. I slept through the night without waking up to a racing pulse. I believed the worst of the betrayal was behind me. The storm had passed, and I had survived the wreckage. Emboldened by this false sense of safety, I called my real estate agent, Brenda. I told her the administrative issue with my inheritance was being resolved, and I wanted to rebook the viewing for the riverfront condo. Brenda was thrilled. She knew how long I had been searching for the right property. We met on a bright Tuesday afternoon. The condo was located in a quiet, tree-lined community along the Delaware River. It was everything I had envisioned during those long, exhausting shifts at the clinic. We walked up the exterior stairs to the second floor, and Brenda unlocked the door. The living room was empty, echoing slightly with our footsteps. The hardwood floors gleamed under the natural light pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked over to the glass doors and looked out at the water. The river moved slowly, reflecting the clear blue sky. It was peaceful. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, optics-driven life my parents and brother led. There were no leased luxury cars parked outside. There was no pressure to perform. It was just a quiet space that I had earned through a decade of strict discipline. Brenda handed me a bright, glossy brochure detailing the property specifications. The heavy cardstock felt substantial in my hands. The brochure listed the square footage, the recent kitchen upgrades, and the homeowner association fees. I ran my fingers over the printed floor plan, mentally placing my small sofa in the corner and a reading chair by the window. I had saved for 10 years to stand in this room. My family had tried to steal this future from me, but I had fought back and secured it. I was standing in the sunlight holding the brochure smiling as Brenda talked about the 30-day closing process and the nearby walking trails. Then my phone rang. The sound pierced the quiet echo of the empty living room. I pulled the phone from my purse. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar corporate toll-free number. I hesitated. My first instinct was to silence the call and continue looking at the kitchen countertops. But a small lingering anxiety from my meeting with David Rossi nudged at my conscience. I thought it might be the internal fraud department from my bank following up on the identity theft affidavit I had filed. I wanted to make sure my accounts were fully secured. I apologized to Brenda, stepped away from the bright windows, and answered the call. A man with a crisp, sterile voice spoke on the other end. He did not ask how I was doing. He asked to speak with Lydia Hartman. I confirmed my identity. The man introduced himself as a collections agent from Apex Commercial Lending. The name hit my ears like a physical strike. It was the exact same imposing corporate name my accountant had found buried in the secondary credit report 2 weeks ago. The bright sunlight warming the hardwood floors suddenly felt freezing cold. The air in the empty living room grew thin. The agent did not pause to let me process the name. He operated with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate debt collector. He asked if he was speaking to the legal CO signer for Connor Luxury Auto Detailing. I stood frozen in the middle of the room. My vocal cords felt paralyzed. I stammered, telling the agent he had made a mistake. I told him I was not a co-signer for any business. I said my brother owned the detailing shop and I had no legal connection to his company. The agent did not apologize for the mix-up. His tone hardened, adopting a rigid professional severity. He informed me that my Social Security number, my verified income history from the dental clinic, and my signature were all present on the finalized loan origination documents. He pulled up the file on his end and verified my current address, my date of birth, and the exact date the loan was executed. Then he delivered the cruel pressure line that shattered my false peace into 1,000 jagged pieces. He said, "Ms. Hartman, the business is 90 days past due on the $150,000 equipment loan. As the legal guarantor, you are in default. $150,000. The number echoed in my mind, drowning out the sound of the river outside. I dropped the glossy condo brochure. It hit the hardwood floor with a soft, hollow slap. Brenda stopped talking mid-sentence. She looked at me, her welcoming smile contorting into a mask of deep confusion and concern. I could not meet her eyes. My hand shook with a sudden, uncontrollable tremor as I pressed the phone against my ear. The terrifying breadcrumb my accountant had found had just detonated into a catastrophic reality. The $61,000 inheritance theft was never the main event. It was just the entry fee. My parents had stolen my cash to provide the required capital injection, securing a much larger commercial line of credit in my name. They had not just taken my savings. They had stolen my identity. They had used my perfect credit score to prop up a dead business. Connor had driven his detailing shop into the ground. He had leased luxury cars, bought expensive jewelry for his wife, and hemorrhaged money until his commercial lenders threatened to cut him off. He had failed at every aspect of running a legitimate company. Instead of letting his business close and facing the consequences of his own reckless choices, he had allowed my parents to hand him my pristine financial record. The golden child believed he could simply walk away from a massive commercial failure, letting his quiet, responsible sister take the fall. He expected to sleep soundly in his large suburban house while I answered calls from aggressive debt collectors. He thought he could continue playing the successful entrepreneur, while my life was quietly dismantled to pay for his props. My parents had orchestrated the entire scheme. They believed my spotless record was a family asset, a tool they could deploy to shield their son from ruin. They knew Connor was unbankable. They knew his credit was destroyed. They looked at my disciplined life, my 10-year-old car, and my modest apartment, and they decided I did not need my clean credit as much as Connor needed a bailout. They had tethered me to a sinking ship without ever asking for my consent. They had legally cloned my financial identity to create a human shield for their favorite child. I stood in the empty apartment that was supposed to be my sanctuary. My voice broke as I repeated into the receiver that I was not a guarantor. I told the agent I had never signed those papers. The collections agent ignored my denial. He recited the legal penalties for commercial default, informing me that the lender had the right to seize assets and pursue aggressive recovery measures. The illusion of safety was gone. I was no longer just fighting for my stolen savings. I was on the hook for $150,000, and the creditors were coming for everything I had left. I hung up the phone. I did not explain the situation to Brenda. I picked up the glossy brochure from the hardwood floor, handed it back to her without a word, and walked out of this condo. I drove straight from the quiet riverfront community to the industrial park where Connor leased his shop. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The drive took 40 minutes, but it felt like 5. The pure blinding rage burned away any remaining hesitation. My family had not just made a terrible financial mistake. They had systematically, deliberately constructed a trap using my identity, and they had let the heavy steel door slam shut with me inside it. Connor's detailing business was located in a large commercial warehouse district off a busy highway. The exterior of the building was painted a sleek, modern charcoal gray. A massive illuminated sign bearing the name Connor's Luxury Auto hung above the large garage bays. The presentation was flawless, designed to attract high-end clientele who wanted their sports cars pampered. But when I pulled into the parking lot, the illusion evaporated. The lot was completely empty. There were no Maseratis waiting for a ceramic coat. There were no Mercedes SUVs lined up for interior detailing. The massive garage bays were shut tight. I parked my faded sedan near the main office entrance and walked up to the glass door. I pushed it open. The bell above the door chimed a hollow, cheerful sound that echoed in the cavernous, deserted space. The interior of the shop was a ghost town. The polished concrete floors were coated in a fine layer of dust. The expensive buffing equipment sat idle in the corners covered by plastic tarps. The custom lighting rigs installed to highlight the curves of expensive vehicles illuminated nothing but empty space. I walked past the empty bays toward the glass-enclosed office at the back of the shop. I pushed the office door open without knocking. Connor was sitting behind a large mahogany desk. He was not reviewing spreadsheets or calling clients. He was leaning back in an expensive ergonomic chair, staring at a wall-mounted monitor, playing a first-person shooter video game. He wore a designer hoodie and pristine white sneakers. He looked like a teenager relaxing in a basement, not a business owner 90 days past due on a 6-figure commercial loan. Helen was there too. My mother stood near a small kitchenette area in the corner of the office. She was wearing her usual polished suburban attire, a tailored blouse, and expensive slacks. She was carefully unpacking a premium deli sandwich from a brown paper bag, arranging the napkins, and laying out a plastic fork as if she were preparing a picnic. Connor paused, his game irritated by the interruption. He rolled his eyes a slow, exaggerated motion and let out a heavy sigh. He did not look panicked. He did not look like a man whose business was collapsing. He looked annoyed that his older sister had disturbed his afternoon. He glanced at me and asked what I was doing there. I walked over to his mahogany desk. I unzipped my purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a printout of the $150,000 default notice I had demanded the Apex Collections agent email to me while I sat in my car. The document outlined the principal balance, the mounting late fees, and the impending legal action required to seize assets from the designated guarantor. I slammed the paper flat onto the center of his desk, right over his gaming keyboard. I asked him why a commercial lender was calling my cell phone to collect his debt. Connor glanced down at the paper. He did not flinch. He did not apologize. He picked up the default notice, looked at the total balance, and tossed it back onto the desk with supreme indifference. He leaned back in his expensive chair and crossed his arms. He defended the fraud with the casual tone of someone discussing a minor scheduling conflict. He said we had to use your credit, Lydia. Mine was shot. It was just a formality. A formality. He called a $150,000 fraudulent commercial guarantee a formality. He viewed my perfect credit score, built over a decade of disciplined sacrifice, as a communal family asset he was entitled to access whenever he maxed out his own resources. He fully expected to walk away from his massive business failure scot-free. leaving me to absorb the catastrophic financial damage. Helen stopped arranging the deli sandwich. She did not look shocked or embarrassed that I had discovered the full extent of the betrayal. She wiped her hands on a napkin and walked over to stand beside Connor's chair. She physically placed herself between me and the golden child, establishing a protective barrier. She looked at me with cold, calculating authority. She was not acting as a mother caught in a lie. She was acting as a project manager defending a controversial business decision. I demanded to know how they had executed the document. A commercial loan guarantee of that size requires more than just a forged signature. It requires identity verification. It requires a sworn witness. I stared at Helen, watching the realization click into place. Thomas had not just scribbled my name on a wire transfer form in his home office. They had physically brought a notary public to the loan signing. They had orchestrated a sophisticated multi-step fraud. Helen did not deny it. She admitted that a friend of hers, a woman she served with on the local township planning board who held a notary license, had stamped the documents. Helen had convinced her friend that I was simply too busy at the dental clinic to attend the signing in person. The notary, trusting Helen's polished suburban reputation, had illegally applied her official seal without verifying my identity or witnessing my signature. My parents had actively recruited a friend to commit a felony, all to ensure Connor received his bailout. I stood in the silent office looking at the two of them. The sheer audacity of their actions was paralyzing. They had conspired to clone my financial identity. They had forged legal documents and corrupted a licensed official. And they had done it all so Connor could lease another Porsche and play video games in an empty warehouse while his business rotted from the inside out. I told Helen that Apex Commercial Lending was threatening to freeze my personal bank accounts. I told her the collections agent warned me they would initiate wage garnishment. I explained that I could lose my job at the dental clinic, lose my apartment, and face complete financial ruin because they had tied me to a defaulting commercial loan. Helen did not offer to sell her suburban home to cover the debt. She did not tell Connor to sell his designer watches or his luxury car. She picked up the plastic fork, tapped it against the edge of the desk, and delivered a line so breathtakingly cruel it felt like a physical blow. She said, "It is a family business, Lydia. We all shoulder the weight. You have a steady job. They will not take much from you. They will not take much from you." She was talking about a $150,000 commercial debt. She looked at my modest life, my steady paycheck from the clinic, and my disciplined savings, and she decided I was a resource capable of absorbing the blow. She expected me to surrender a portion of my salary every 2 weeks for the next decade to pay for a failing auto detailing shop I had no part in building. She believed my quiet resilience meant I would simply adjust my budget, cancel my condo plans, and endure the wage garnishment so Connor could maintain his comfortable illusion. Connor turned back to his monitor. He picked up his gaming controller, his attention already drifting away from the conversation. He expected his mother to handle the unpleasant confrontation. He expected me to accept my assigned role as the family shield. He was completely insulated from consequence, hiding behind my stolen signature. The rage that had propelled me to the shop hardened into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. The initial shock of the $61,000 inheritance theft was replaced by the terrifying realization that my family viewed my entire existence as a disposable utility. They did not love me. They did not respect my hard work. They only valued me for the financial leverage my clean record provided. I looked at Helen aggressively unpacking the rest of the deli sandwich, preparing to feed the 34-year-old son who had just bankrupted his sister. I looked at Connor, completely disengaged from the destruction he had caused. I realized there was no emotional appeal that would reach them. They were incapable of feeling guilt because they truly believed their actions were justified. In their twisted moral logic, sacrificing the quiet daughter to save the golden child was not a crime. It was simply good family management. I did not scream. I did not flip the mahogany desk or tear the gaming controller from Connor's hands. I reached out and picked up the printed default notice. I folded the paper carefully, sliding it into my purse. I told Helen and Connor that I was not a partner in their family business. I told them I would not shoulder a single ounce of their weight. I turned my back on them and walked out of the glass office. I walked past the idle buffing machines and the empty garage bays. The hollow chime of the front doorbell echoed behind me as I stepped back out into the parking lot. The sun had disappeared behind a thick layer of gray clouds. The real war had begun. The creditors were not just sending letters. They were actively moving to seize my assets. The corporate machinery of Apex Commercial Lending was waking up, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the consequences of my parents' forgery arrived at my doorstep, threatening to tear down the last remaining pillars of my independent life. The drive back from Connor's empty detailing shop was a blur of adrenaline and cold calculation. I had confronted my family and heard them explicitly admit to a coordinated multi-tier federal crime. They had not apologized. They had expected me to adjust my lifestyle to pay off a massive commercial default. The following morning, I returned to the dental clinic. I arrived early, walking through the sliding glass doors, desperately hoping the familiar routine of diagnostic codes, insurance portals, and patient scheduling would ground me. I sat at my terminal, logged in, and focused intensely on the screen. The clinic filled with the usual morning hum. The hygienists called patients back to the treatment bays, the phones rang steadily, and the waiting room chairs occupied quickly. I needed the clinic to remain my sanctuary. I needed the predictable rhythm of my job to shield me from the chaotic collapse my family had engineered. At 10:15, the front doors slid open. A man walked into the reception area. He did not look like a typical dental patient. He wore a rumpled tan suit jacket over a polo shirt, and his posture was rigid, purposeful, and entirely unbothered by the medical environment. He carried a thick manila envelope tucked tightly under his left arm. He bypassed the sign and kiosk and walked directly toward the main reception counter. He did not wait in the short line of patients waiting to check out. He stepped to the side, squared his shoulders, and scanned the faces of the staff behind the desk. The man did not lower his voice. He did not respect the quiet, sterile atmosphere of the medical waiting room. He projected his voice loudly, cutting through the low murmur of patient conversations and the faint background music. He asked for Lydia Hartman. I looked up from my monitor. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stood up slowly, stepping toward the transaction window. The man looked at my face, checked a small photo clipped to the front of his envelope, and confirmed my identity with a sharp professional nod. He reached over the high counter and dropped the thick manila envelope onto the granite surface. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the stone echoed across the reception area. The man declared loudly that I had been formally served. He stated that the contents of the envelope contained a civil summons from Apex Commercial Lending regarding a $150,000 default. He turned on his heel and walked out of the clinic before the sliding doors had fully closed behind him. The waiting room went completely silent. 7 patients sitting in the plush chairs lowered their magazines. A mother holding a toddler stopped mid-sentence. 2 dental assistants standing near the hallway froze. Everyone stared at the heavy manila envelope sitting on my desk, and then they stared at me. The silence was thick, awkward, and suffocating. The polished professional reputation I had spent a decade building shattered in the span of 30 seconds. I was the financial coordinator for a lucrative, trusted medical practice, and a process server had just publicly branded me a commercial deadbeat in front of the people who paid my salary. Sarah, the clinic manager, stepped out of the back hallway. She had heard the man's voice. She looked at the envelope on the counter, then at the staring patients, and finally at my face, which was burning with intense, inescapable humiliation. Sarah did not ask what had happened. She moved quickly into damage control mode. She instructed the junior receptionist to handle the next patient in line. She walked behind the counter, picked up the heavy legal summons, and told me to follow her into her office immediately. I walked down the hallway, feeling the weight of every gaze tracking my movement. The sanctuary of my workplace had been breached. The protective wall I had tried to build between my career and my family's criminality had failed entirely. Sarah closed her office door. She dropped the thick envelope onto her desk blotter. The document looked imposing, dense with legal threats, corporate letterheads, and formal demands for immediate financial restitution. This was no longer a localized warning from a payroll compliance algorithm. This was a massive, aggressive commercial lawsuit invading a medical facility. The debt collectors at Apex Commercial Lending did not care about family drama, forged signatures, or deceptive parents. They cared about the legal guarantee attached to my name, and they were deploying ruthless public tactics to recover their money. Sarah sat down behind her desk. She did not look sympathetic. She looked exhausted, alarmed, and deeply concerned about the stability of her clinic. She ran her hands over her face, took a deep breath, and looked at me with a stark, uncompromising expression. She told me she had gone to bat for me with corporate HR when the initial tax anomaly flagged my profile. She had trusted the identity theft affidavit I provided, believing the issue was contained. But a public process server delivering a six-figure lawsuit in a crowded waiting room crossed a hard, non-negotiable line. Sarah folded her hands tightly on the desk. She delivered a line that cut straight through my remaining defenses. She said, "Lydia, I want to trust you, but I cannot have process servers disrupting patient care for a $250,000 lawsuit." The reality of my situation tightened around my throat. My family's lie had successfully invaded my real life, and this time my job might not survive the impact. Sarah warned me that corporate human resources would likely suspend me pending the outcome of the litigation. A medical practice cannot employ a financial coordinator who is actively being sued by a commercial lending institution for massive default. The optics were disastrous. The liability was too high. I sat in the chair across from her, staring at the thick legal summons. My parents had told me it was just paperwork. They had assured me the problem would blow over. They believed their actions were confined to their suburban home and Connor's empty detailing shop. They never considered the collateral damage of their choices. Or worse, they did consider it, and they simply did not care. Connor was currently hiding in his warehouse playing video games, completely insulated from the public humiliation and the professional ruin his debt had caused. He was letting me take the public bullets while he remained comfortably in the shadows. The sheer injustice of the moment was paralyzing. I was being served at work facing suspension and public disgrace for a business I did not own, for a loan I did not sign, and for a brother who refused to take responsibility for his own failures. My mother had confidently told me they would not take much from me. She had severely miscalculated the aggression of commercial debt collectors. Apex Commercial Lending was not going to quietly garnish a fraction of my paycheck. They were actively dismantling my life to force a settlement. I looked at Sarah. I could see the disappointment in her eyes. The moral trap was fully engaged. If I tried to explain that my parents had committed notary fraud to secure the loan, I would sound like an unstable employee caught in a chaotic criminal family web. My boss needed an employee who managed insurance claims, not an employee managing federal fraud investigations. I had no defense that did not make me look like a massive corporate liability. I picked up the thick manila envelope from Sarah's desk. The weight of the paper felt like a physical anchor dragging me down. I apologized for the disruption in the waiting room. I told Sarah I needed the rest of the day to handle a legal emergency. She nodded slowly, granting the request, but her expression confirmed what we both knew. My position at the clinic was no longer secure. I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and my family had just pushed me over. I walked out the back exit of the clinic, avoiding the waiting room. I got into my old Honda, tossed the heavy summons onto the passenger seat, and gripped the steering wheel. I was cornered. The federal identity theft affidavit had stopped the IRS, but it was not enough to stop a highly motivated commercial lender armed with a notarized guarantee. Apex wanted their $150,000, and they had legally targeted the only person in the Hartman family with verifiable income and clean credit. My parents believed I would surrender. They thought the pressure of the lawsuit, the threat to my job, and the public humiliation would break my resolve. They expected me to eventually assume the debt, negotiate a payment plan, and sacrifice my future to protect Connor's lifestyle. They had built a trap so comprehensive, so damaging, that compliance seemed like the only survivable option. I sat in my car staring at the thick legal document, realizing that passive defense was no longer viable. I could not hide behind an accountant's affidavit. I had to face the people who built the trap, and I had to break it from the inside out. I drove aimlessly for an hour after leaving the clinic, the heavy manila envelope sitting on my passenger seat like an unexploded bomb. The lawsuit from Apex Commercial Lending was real aggressive and currently jeopardizing the only stable thing in my life. I parked my car near a small suburban park and stared at the steering wheel. My phone buzzed in the center console. I expected it to be a follow-up message from my manager, Sarah, outlining my impending corporate suspension. Instead, the screen displayed a text from my mother, Helen. The message did not ask how I was doing. It did not apologize for the process server arriving at my workplace. Helen wrote that the family needed to convene at their house immediately. She called it a mandatory family meeting to discuss a solution to the Apex issue. The phrasing was deliberate. She did not call it Connor's default or Thomas's forgery. She called it the Apex issue, effectively minimizing the criminality and framing the crisis as a communal burden we all had to manage. I knew walking into my parents' house was stepping into an ambush, but the alternative was waiting in my cramped apartment for the legal system to dismantle my life. I needed to know exactly what they were planning. I needed to see the architecture of the trap they were trying to spring. I put my car in gear and drove to the wide, manicured streets of Somerset County. The driveway was full. Connor's black Porsche was parked haphazardly near the garage. When I opened the heavy oak front door, the atmosphere inside the house was entirely different from the night they ate expensive sushi and drank wine. The house was quiet, tense, and heavy with manufactured gravity. They were gathered around the large formal dining table in the front room, a space usually reserved for Thanksgiving dinners and important announcements. Helen sat at one end of the long mahogany table, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Thomas sat next to her, looking exhausted and thoroughly defeated, staring at the polished wood. Connor slouched in his chair, avoiding eye contact, rhythmically tapping his phone against the table edge. Next to him sat his wife, Jessica. Jessica was crying. She held a balled-up tissue in her hand, her shoulders shaking with quiet, rhythmic sobs. I walked into the room and remained standing near the doorway. I did not sit down. Sitting down implies negotiation, and I had not come to negotiate the terms of my own execution. Helen gestured to the empty chair across from her. She spoke with a calm, measured authority, adopting the tone of a pragmatic manager handling a difficult corporate merger. She told me they had spoken with a legal specialist, a lawyer Connor had hired to navigate the collapse of his detailing business. She slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the smooth mahogany surface. The document stopped near the edge of the table, inches from where I stood. The top page bolded the words, "Restructuring Agreement." Helen did not wait for me to read the document. She delivered the pitch with smooth, practiced efficiency. She explained that the commercial lender was moving aggressively against the business assets. If Connor defaulted entirely, the bank would pursue his personal property to satisfy the massive debt. The shady lawyer had devised a strategy to shield Connor's suburban home and his remaining assets from seizure. The strategy required a specific type of targeted bankruptcy filing. There was only one catch. The bankruptcy maneuver required Connor to prove he was not the sole proprietor responsible for the catastrophic loss. The lawyer needed a recognized business partner to absorb a designated portion of the liability. Helen looked at me. The plan was breathtaking in its cruelty. They wanted me to sign the restructuring agreement. They wanted me to put my signature on a document officially admitting that I was a knowing active partner in Connor's luxury auto. By signing the agreement, I would legally legitimize the forged loan guarantee. I would absolve my father of the felony notary fraud, and I would willingly accept a massive portion of the $150,000 debt. They wanted me to commit financial suicide so Connor could file for a protective bankruptcy and keep his house. I stared at the document sitting on the table. The sheer audacity of their counterattack was paralyzing. They had used the impending lawsuit not as a wake-up call to take responsibility, but as leverage to force my compliance. They had engineered a disaster, and now they were demanding I throw myself on the grenade to save the golden child from the shrapnel. Jessica leaned forward, her face flushed and streaked with tears. She utilized the most potent weapon in their arsenal. She did not appeal to logic or fairness. She appealed to raw, weaponized guilt. She pressed the tissue to her eyes and asked me how I could even hesitate. She told me that if the bank seized their assets, they would lose their home. She looked at me, her voice cracking with calculated desperation, and asked where my nieces were supposed to sleep if the bank took their house. My nieces, twin girls 4 years old. Jessica was actively using her own children as human shields to protect her husband's reckless financial failures. She was demanding that I surrender my savings, my credit score, and my future home so her daughters would not have to downsize their suburban lifestyle. She wanted me to pay the price for the Porsche parked in the driveway and the expensive jewelry on her wrist. I looked at Connor. He finally stopped tapping his phone. He looked at me, his expression devoid of any genuine remorse. He did not offer an apology. He did not suggest selling his luxury vehicle to cover a fraction of the debt. He fully expected his sister to absorb the catastrophic blow so he could emerge from the wreckage relatively unscathed. He thought he could shield his assets by throwing me to the wolves, and he expected our parents to enforce the transaction. I turned my gaze to Helen. I expected my mother to offer some token gesture of compromise, perhaps a promise to slowly pay me back over the next 20 years. But Helen did not offer compromise. She offered a cold, clinical assessment of my worth within the family hierarchy. She looked at me with a stark, calculating stare and delivered the cruel pressure line that summarized my entire existence in their eyes. She said, "You are single, Lydia. Your credit can take a hit for a few years. Connor has a family. Do not be selfish." The room went dead silent. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. You are single. Do not be selfish. In my mother's moral calculus, my lack of a husband and children rendered my future expendable. My discipline, my 10 years of saving, my spotless professional record, and my modest dream of buying a quiet condo by the river meant absolutely nothing compared to Connor's comfort. Because my life was simple, they believed it was disposable. They viewed me as an asset to be liquidated whenever the golden child faced a deficit. My independence was not an achievement. It was an invitation for exploitation. My father remained silent. Thomas stared at the mahogany table, refusing to intervene, as his wife and daughter-in-law relentlessly pressured me into signing away my life. His cowardice was total and complete. He had forged my name, initiated this entire disaster, and now he was letting the women in his family bully me into covering his tracks. The disgust I felt was profound. It was a physical revulsion, a cold sickness in my stomach. The family I had spent my entire life trying to placate was sitting around a formal dining table, actively trying to destroy me to preserve their illusion of success. I did not yell. I did not flip the heavy stack of papers off the table. I looked at Jessica, whose tears had momentarily stopped as she waited for my surrender. I looked at Connor, whose arrogant expectation filled the room. I looked at Helen, whose cold, calculating gaze demanded my submission. I told them I would not sign the agreement. I told them I was not a partner in the business, I did not authorize the loan, and I would not sacrifice my future to pay for Connor's mistakes. Helen's polite, managerial facade cracked instantly. Her face flushed dark red with genuine furious anger. She stood up, slamming her hands flat against the mahogany table. She told me I was making a catastrophic mistake. She warned me that if I did not sign the agreement, the commercial lender would pursue aggressive recovery. She told me Apex Commercial Lending would not care about my identity theft claims. They wanted their money and they would freeze my assets to get it. I knew she was right about the bank's aggression, but I refused to let her use that fear to break me. I turned around and walked toward the front door. As I reached the entryway, Connor finally spoke. His voice was laced with a smug, menacing confidence. He told me I had exactly 7 days. He said the lawyer had informed them that Apex Commercial Lending had scheduled a final settlement meeting for next Friday. If the restructuring agreement was not signed and filed before that meeting, the bank would file an emergency injunction to freeze all guarantor accounts. He leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile returning to his face. He told me the clock was ticking, and by next Friday the bank would take my money whether I signed the paper or not. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the humid afternoon. The threat was explicit. A ticking clock had been introduced. I had exactly 7 days before a corporate entity wiped out my bank accounts and initiated wage garnishment. My family had laid out the terms of my execution, expecting the terror of an impending financial freeze to force me back to the table. They believed the pressure would eventually crush my resolve. They did not realize that by setting a deadline, they had given me exactly what I needed. They had given me a timeline to build a bomb of my own, and I intended to drop it directly on the final meeting. The 7-day deadline hung over my life like a guillotine. The threat Connor delivered at the mahogany dining table was not an empty bluff designed to scare me. It was a verified aggressive legal strategy initiated by a corporate lender trying to mitigate a massive loss. The very next morning, while I was sitting at my desk in the dental clinic, my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed the same corporate toll-free number from my interrupted condo viewing. I answered the call. The man on the other end was not the collections agent I had spoken to previously. He introduced himself as Mr. Vance, a senior loan officer handling distressed commercial accounts for Apex Commercial Lending. Vance spoke with the rapid, impatient cadence of a man who deals exclusively with failing business owners and defaulting guarantors. He did not care about the emotional distress in my voice. He cared about recovering $150,000. Vance informed me that Connor's attorney had presented the proposed restructuring agreement to the bank. Vance laid out the bank's timeline with cold, unyielding precision. He explained that Apex was willing to accept the restructuring terms, which would shield Connor's primary residence from seizure, but only if the listed guarantor legally acknowledged the debt and formally assumed a designated portion of the repayment schedule. The bank had scheduled a final settlement meeting for next Friday at 9 a.m. at their regional corporate office. Vance delivered the ultimatum. He stated that if I did not attend the Friday meeting and sign the agreement, Apex would immediately petition the court for an emergency injunction. They would execute a hard freeze on all of my personal bank accounts, including my high-yield savings containing my emergency funds. They would formally initiate wage garnishment proceedings against my salary at the dental clinic. I looked at the small calendar sitting on the corner of my desk. I picked up a red pen and drew a thick circle around the date. Friday, 7 days away. The bank had created an unavoidable timeline. The corporate machinery was fully engaged, grinding forward without any consideration for the fact that my signature on their loan origination document was a forgery. Vance ended the call, leaving me staring at the red circle on my calendar. The moral trap my family had constructed was staggering in its complexity. They had backed me into a corner where every exit required me to endure massive trauma. If I showed up at the bank on Friday and signed the restructuring agreement, I would legitimize the fraud. I would willingly chain myself to a massive commercial debt, surrendering my hard-earned savings and my dream of buying the riverfront condo. I would absorb the financial ruin so Connor could keep his house and his luxury lifestyle. But if I refused to sign the bank, would freeze my assets anyway, dragging me through years of expensive litigation to prove I was a victim of identity theft. The only way to stop the bank from freezing my accounts was to prove the fraud before the injunction was filed. I had to prove that the initial $61,000 capital injection and the subsequent loan guarantee were entirely fabricated. And to prove that I had to expose the mechanics of the crime. I had to expose my father forging the wire transfer. I had to expose my mother recruiting her friend to illegally stamp the notary seal. If I went to the local police department and filed a criminal complaint regarding the notary fraud and the forged loan documents, I would be initiating a federal investigation into my own parents. I would be handing the authorities the evidence needed to send Thomas and Helen to prison. My family knew this. They banked on my deeply ingrained reluctance to pull that trigger. They set the meeting with the bank for the 7th day, fully expecting me to show up, sign the papers, and quietly take the fall because they believed I lacked the capacity to destroy them. I left the clinic during my lunch break and drove directly to David Rossi's accounting office. I told him about the phone call with Vance, the impending asset freeze, and the Friday deadline. David listened intently, his face grim. He advised me that fighting a commercial lender from a defensive position was incredibly difficult. The bank held a notarized document bearing my name. In the eyes of the law, until proven otherwise, I was the guarantor. David made a phone call. He contacted a colleague, a specialized fraud attorney, who handled complex financial disputes. The attorney agreed to meet with us that same afternoon. For the next 4 days, my life was consumed by the meticulous, relentless assembly of a defense. I met with the fraud attorney and David Rossi for hours at a time. We did not build a generic defense strategy. We built a nuclear option. We compiled a comprehensive, indisputable dossier of evidence. David secured the certified IP logs from the bank, proving the initial $61,000 wire transfer was executed from the router located at my parents' suburban address during a time when my employee punch card proved I was physically working at the dental clinic. The attorney tracked down the registration number of the notary seal applied to the commercial loan guarantee. He pulled the public employment records of the notary, proving her long-standing relationship with Helen through their mutual positions on the local township planning board. He secured an affidavit from a forensic handwriting expert confirming the signature on the loan guarantee did not match the established baseline of my actual signature. The evidence was undeniable. It was a cold, hard, documented trail of felony fraud. But the attorney warned me that simply mailing the dossier to the local police would not stop the bank from freezing my accounts on Friday. The corporate legal process moved faster than criminal investigations. To stop the emergency injunction and protect my assets, I had to drop the evidence directly onto the desk of the commercial lender before the deadline expired. I had to present the proof of fraud to Mr. Vance at the settlement meeting, forcing the bank to immediately halt their collection efforts against me. The plan was set. I had to walk into the final arena, sit across from my family, and detonate the bomb. On Wednesday evening, 2 days before the bank meeting, my phone vibrated on my kitchen counter. I had spent the past few days avoiding all contact with my family, ignoring voicemails from Helen and missed calls from Connor. I picked up the phone and looked at the screen. The message was from my father, Thomas. The text message read, "See you at the bank on Friday, Lyd. Thank you for stepping up for the family." I stared at the glowing words. The sheer arrogance of the message made my blood run cold. He was thanking me for stepping up. He was framing my impending financial execution as a noble sacrifice, a voluntary act of familial loyalty. He was actively maintaining the delusion that this was a cooperative effort rather than a desperate hostage situation. He was holding a gun to my head, demanding my wallet, and thanking me for my generosity. My parents and my brother were treating my surrender as a foregone conclusion. They had orchestrated the theft, recruited the corrupt notary, scheduled the meeting, and set the deadline. They firmly believed their plan was foolproof because they believed I was fundamentally weak. They expected a clean slate by Friday morning. They thought they had successfully executed a massive financial heist masked entirely as a forced family favor. I did not reply to his text message. I put my phone down on the counter. I walked into my bedroom and pulled a heavy, unassuming brown leather tote bag from the top shelf of my closet. I carried the bag into the living room and set it on the coffee table. I picked up the thick, tabbed stack of documents the fraud attorney and David Rossi had compiled. The dossier contained the IP logs, the handwriting analysis, the notary records, and the sworn identity theft affidavits. It was a dense, heavy stack of paper. I placed the dossier carefully inside the leather bag. The physical weight of the evidence was substantial. It pulled the straps taut when I lifted the bag by the handles. I set the heavy bag by the front door right next to my car keys. I had spent my entire life trying to be the invisible, low-maintenance daughter. I had kept my head down, lived within my means, and absorbed the friction caused by the golden child's constant failures. My family had looked at my quiet discipline and decided it was a weapon they could use for their own benefit. They had mistaken my silence for compliance. They had mistaken my caution for cowardice. The deadline was approaching. The clock was ticking down to Friday morning. The final showdown at Apex Commercial Lending was set. My family expected me to walk into that conference room and sign away my future. They expected me to carry the weight of their crimes. I looked at the heavy leather bag sitting by the door. I was going to carry the weight, but I was not going to carry it for them. I was going to carry it right into the bank, and I was going to drop it directly on their heads. Thursday night arrived with a quiet, tense stillness. It was the eve of the settlement meeting. I was standing in the narrow kitchen of my apartment, making a cup of tea. The heavy leather tote bag holding the nuclear dossier of evidence was still sitting by the front door exactly where I had placed it the day before. The apartment was my sanctuary. It was not spacious, and the floorboards were uneven, but it was mine. I had paid the rent on time for 7 years. I had decorated the walls with prints I bought at local art fairs, and I kept the counters meticulously clean. It was the one place in the world where the chaotic demands of my family could not reach me. At 7:30, a sharp, authoritative knock broke the silence of the apartment. I set my mug on the counter. I had not ordered any food, and I was not expecting company. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Standing in the poorly lit hallway of my third-floor walk-up were my mother Helen and my brother Connor. My heart hammered against my ribs. I did not want to open the door. I wanted to pretend I was not home, but the glow of the lamp visible beneath the doorframe betrayed my presence. They knew I was inside. Reluctantly, I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open a few inches. Helen did not wait for an invitation. She pushed the door wider and stepped into my apartment, bringing Connor in right behind her. They had invaded my safe haven. My parents had rarely visited my apartment over the past 7 years. They preferred hosting at their sprawling suburban home where they could control the environment and the optics. Their presence in my cramped living room felt suffocating and deeply wrong. Helen was holding a bottle of wine. She presented it to me with a tight manufactured smile. She called it a peace offering. I looked at the label. It was a cheap, generic red blend you can buy at any corner grocery store. It was the kind of wine you bring to a casual acquaintance, not the kind of wine you bring to a daughter you have just saddled with $250,000 in fraudulent debt. It was a stark contrast to the expensive Barolo they had ordered at the celebratory dinner paid for with my stolen inheritance. I did not take the bottle. I left my hands at my sides. Helen ignored my refusal. She walked past me, set the cheap wine on my small dining table, and began looking around the room. Connor did not even pretend to offer peace. He walked into the center of my living room with the arrogant, entitled swagger of a man who owns the building. He was wearing his expensive designer sneakers. He did not bother to wipe his feet on the welcome mat. He tracked faint smudges of dark dirt across my beige carpet. He stood in the middle of the room, looking at the faded paint on the walls and the small dimensions of the space. He smirked, shaking his head slightly. He commented on how incredibly small the apartment was. He said it with a tone of profound pity, as if he were touring a charity project. He looked around my living room and stated that it was practically a closet. He used the size of my home to justify the theft of my money. In his mind, my modest living conditions confirmed that I did not need the $61,000. He reinforced the narrative that his failing luxury business and his leased Porsche were simply more important than my quiet, disciplined life. The rage flared hot and sharp in my chest, but I kept my face blank. I crossed my arms and asked them why they had come. Helen turned away from examining a framed print on my wall. She stepped toward me and attempted to pull me into an embrace. I stiffened, refusing to return the gesture. She patted my arm affectionately, an entirely hollow motion. She lowered her voice, adopting the tone of a supportive mother comforting an anxious child. She told me she knew tomorrow was going to be a difficult day. She said she understood the pressure I was feeling, but she assured me we would get through it together. We would get through it together. She was speaking as if we were a united front facing an external enemy. She was actively ignoring the fact that she and Thomas were the architects of my ruin. She was framing the impending bank meeting as a shared hardship, rather than a scheduled execution where I was the sole casualty. I stepped back physically, separating myself from her touch. I told her the bank meeting was not a shared hardship. I reminded her that Apex Commercial Lending was coming after my wages and my savings because she and Thomas had forged my signature and corrupted a notary. Connor let out a short, dismissive laugh. He walked over to my small sofa and leaned against the backrest. He did not look ashamed of the forgery. He looked entirely confident in the plan. He told me not to worry about the technicalities of the paperwork. He casually mentioned that Helen's friend, the notary who had illegally stamped the documents, would be present at the settlement meeting tomorrow morning. Connor said she was coming to smooth things over with the loan officer and ensure the transition of liability went flawlessly. The revelation was chilling. My family had not just invaded my apartment, they were here to intimidate me. They were here to perform a final systems check before the trap sprang shut. They knew my compliance was the only thing standing between them and federal prison. They did not trust me to show up and sign away my life willingly, so they had come to my sanctuary to apply physical and psychological pressure. They were reminding me that they had allies, that they had the notary ready to lie on their behalf, and that the narrative was fully locked in place. Helen picked up the bottle of cheap wine and moved it slightly, aligning it with the center of the table. She looked at me with a cold, calculating stare that stripped away the last remnants of her maternal facade. She told me the restructuring agreement was finalized. She warned me that if I backed out at the last minute, the bank would freeze my accounts by noon, and the entire family would be dragged into a messy public scandal. She said the decision had already been made, and all I had to do was show up, sign the papers, and accept my role. They viewed me as entirely weak. They believed my history of quiet obedience guaranteed my future surrender. They looked at my small apartment, my worn carpet, and my faded car, and they saw a woman who lacked the courage to fight back. They thought physical intimidation within the walls of my own home would break whatever fragile resistance I had left. Connor pushed off the sofa. He walked toward the front door, ready to leave. He paused as he passed me, leaning in slightly. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the faint scent of the cheap wine on the table. He looked me up and down, a sneer twisting the corner of his mouth. He told me not to do anything stupid tomorrow, Lyd. He said I did not have the stomach for a fight. The cruel pressure line hit the air with the force of a physical slap. You do not have the stomach for a fight. Connor was entirely secure in his victory. He believed he could walk into my home-track dirt on my carpet, insult my life, and casually threaten my future, all because he was convinced I would never strike back. He thought the Golden Child armor was impenetrable. He expected me to show up at the bank, sign the debt, and quietly absorb the ruin while he walked away with a clean slate. Helen followed him to the door. She offered one final performative smile, telling me to get a good night's sleep and that they would see me at the bank at 9 o'clock sharp. She pulled the door open and stepped out into the hallway. Connor walked out behind her. The heavy door swung shut, the latch clicking into place. I stood in the center of my living room alone. The silence returned, but the sanctity of the apartment had been violated. The faint smear of dirt from Connor's sneakers remained on the beige carpet. The bottle of cheap wine sat on my dining table, an insulting monument to their arrogance. They had invaded my home to ensure my compliance. They had tried to secure their victory through intimidation. But their visit had accomplished the exact opposite. Any lingering trace of familial guilt, any small nagging doubt about deploying the nuclear option I had prepared, evaporated completely. The fear they tried to instill was swallowed whole by a profound, icy determination. I walked over to the dining table. I picked up the bottle of cheap wine. I did not open it. I carried it into the kitchen and dropped it heavily into the trash can. The glass clunked against the plastic bin. I walked back into the living room. I approached the front door and reached for the deadbolt. I turned the lock, securing my apartment. I looked down at the heavy, unassuming brown leather tote bag sitting exactly where I had left it. I bent down and wrapped my fingers around the sturdy handles. I lifted the bag, feeling the substantial physical weight of the evidence dossier inside. The IP logs the handwriting analysis, the notary records the sworn identity theft affidavits. Connor had stood in my living room and confidently declared that I did not have the stomach for a fight. He was right. I did not have the stomach for a fight. I had the stomach for an execution. I carried the heavy leather bag into my bedroom and set it next to my professional work clothes. I was ready for Friday morning. Friday morning broke clear and bright. The heavy humidity of the past few days had vanished, leaving behind a sharp, clean chill in the New Jersey air. I woke up long before my alarm. I made coffee dressed in a tailored navy blazer and black slacks and picked up the heavy brown leather tote bag from the corner of my bedroom. The drive to the regional corporate office of Apex Commercial Lending took 30 minutes. I navigated the highway traffic with cold precision. There was no anxiety left in my chest. The fear had burned out entirely, replaced by a dense, unbreakable calm. The Apex building was a sprawling glass and steel structure located in a corporate park near the Delaware River. The lobby was expansive, featuring gray slate floors and a massive reception desk. I checked in with security, received a visitor badge, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. The doors opened to a quiet, thickly carpeted hallway. A receptionist directed me toward Conference Room B. I stopped outside the heavy glass door and looked through the transparent panels. The room was designed to intimidate. It featured dark wood paneling, recessed lighting, and a massive polished mahogany table running down the center. The trap was fully assembled. Sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table was Loan Officer Vance. He wore a sharp gray suit and was reviewing a stack of printed files on his tablet. Arrayed along the left side of the table were the architects of my ruin. Thomas sat near the center wearing a pressed dress shirt, looking uncomfortable but resolute. Connor lounged next to him in a fitted blazer over a crisp white t-shirt, projecting the image of a casual, successful entrepreneur rather than a defaulting debtor. Helen sat beside Connor, dressed immaculately, her posture perfect. Next to Helen sat her friend from the township, planning board the notary public who had illegally stamped the forged commercial guarantee. The notary looked nervous, constantly adjusting the silver watch on her wrist, but she remained firmly in her seat, ready to provide the necessary lie. They were all there. The entire cast of the heist had gathered for the final act. They had arrived early, presenting a united, respectable suburban front to the commercial lender. They were entirely confident in their victory. They expected their quiet, obedient target to walk through the door, sit down, and silently surrender her future to save them. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped into the conference room. The low hum of conversation stopped instantly. Heads turned. 5 sets of eyes locked onto me. The air in the room was thick and expensive. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of a large analog clock mounted on the far wall. The second hand swept forward, relentless and precise. It was exactly 9 o'clock. I did not apologize for interrupting. I did not greet my parents. I walked past the row of empty leather chairs and took the seat directly across from Connor and Helen. I placed my heavy leather tote bag on the floor next to my chair. Vance looked up from his tablet. His expression was a study in professional disdain. He viewed me through the lens of the narrative my family had carefully constructed. To him, I was the delinquent co-signer. I was the irresponsible business partner who had ignored 90 days of late notices and allowed a $150,000 commercial loan to fall into severe default. I was the liability holding up his ledger. He looked at me the way a teacher looks at a failing student who has finally been dragged into the principal's office. Helen did not miss a beat. The moment I sat down, she activated her performative charm. She smiled warmly at Vance, a gracious maternal expression designed to disarm the corporate officer. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the polished mahogany. She told Vance that the family had experienced some turbulent communication over the past few weeks, but they had finally come to an understanding. She turned her warm, practiced smile toward me. She looked the loan officer in the eye and delivered a line dripping with weaponized hypocrisy. She said, "Our daughter is here to take responsibility. We are so proud of her." The sheer suffocating arrogance of the statement hit the air like a physical force. We are so proud of her. Helen was sitting in a corporate bank surrounded by her accomplices, actively executing a massive financial fraud against her own child, and she had the audacity to frame it as a moment of parental pride. She was attempting to look like a supportive, loving mother, guiding her wayward daughter back to the right path. She expected me to swallow the lie, absorb the debt, and accept the fake praise in front of the man holding the execution order. The moral trap snapped shut around the conference table. Vance looked at me, his expression softening marginally clearly, buying into the narrative of the supportive family helping a troubled business owner. If I caused a scene, I would confirm my status as the erratic, irresponsible debtor. If I stayed silent, the trap would become permanent. Vance tapped the screen of his tablet, signaling the beginning of the formal proceedings. He did not offer small talk. He reached into a leather folio on the table and pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents. The top page was emblazoned with the words, "Restructuring Agreement and Assumption of Liability." Vance pushed the thick stack of paper across the smooth mahogany wood. The document glided silently across the table, stopping precisely in front of me. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a heavy metal pen, and set it down next to the signature line. He leaned back in his leather chair and outlined the terms of my surrender with brutal corporate efficiency. He explained that by signing the document, I formally acknowledged the $150,000 commercial debt. I accepted my role as the primary guarantor. I agreed to a modified repayment schedule that would automatically garnish a percentage of my wages from the dental clinic every month. And most importantly for the people sitting across from me, my signature would formally release Apex Commercial Lending from pursuing any personal assets belonging to Connor. Vance looked at me and stated clearly that signing the agreement was the only way to prevent an immediate emergency freeze on all of my personal bank accounts. I looked down at the thick stack of paper. The signature line was empty, waiting for my compliance. The heavy metal pen rested beside it, gleaming under the recessed lighting. I lifted my gaze and looked at the family sitting across the table. They were perfectly arranged, a tableau of suburban entitlement. Thomas was staring at the paper, refusing to look at my face. Helen maintained her tight, polite smile, watching me with the cold expectation of a predator cornering its prey. The notary friend tapped her fingers nervously on the armrest of her chair, ready to falsely witness the transaction and seal the crime. Connor leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany table. He looked at me, a faint, smug smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He was entirely convinced he had won. He believed he had successfully navigated a catastrophic business failure by throwing his sister into the engine. He thought the decade of quiet discipline I had built was finally being harvested for his benefit. He lowered his voice, offering a cruel, patronizing whisper that carried easily across the quiet table. He said, "Just sign it, Lyd. Let's go home." The audacity of the command was staggering. Let's go home. He wanted me to sign away my future, accept a massive wage garnishment, and surrender my savings, and then he expected us to simply walk out of the building together as a family. He expected me to drive back to my cramped apartment and begin paying for his leased Porsche while he returned to his spacious house with a clean slate. He thought my lifetime of silence guaranteed this final submission. The ticking of the analog clock on the wall seemed to grow louder. The second hand swept past the 12. The pressure in the room was immense, a physical weight bearing down on the empty chair I occupied. Vance watched me, waiting for the administrative procedure to conclude. Helen watched me, expecting the quiet daughter to fold. Connor watched me, waiting to be absolved. They had brought me to the final arena. They had sprung the trap, confident that their prey was defenseless. They did not know the prey was armed. I looked at the heavy metal pen resting on the polished wood. I slowly reached my hand forward. My fingers closed around the cool metal of the pen. I saw Connor's smirk widen slightly. I saw Helen relax her shoulders, exhaling a quiet breath of relief. I saw Thomas finally lift his head, believing the ordeal was over. They thought they had won. They thought the silence had held for one more signature. The heavy metal pen felt cold against my skin. I sat in the plush leather chair and felt the collective expectation of my family pressing down on my shoulders. For 32 years, I had been the silent foundation of their lives. I had absorbed their mistakes. I had ignored their slights. I had allowed them to take my space and my resources, because I believed that compliance was the price of belonging to a family. They watched my fingers grip the pen, and they saw a confirmation of their worldview. They saw the quiet daughter preparing to sign her own financial death warrant to protect the golden son. I watched the tension leave my mother. Helen relaxed her posture, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as she offered a polite practice smile to the loan officer. Connor leaned back in his chair, the smug smirk returning to his face. He believed his clean escape was only seconds away. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the mahogany table, refusing to witness the execution he had orchestrated, but his hands stopped fidgeting. They were already planning their drive back to the suburbs. They were already spending the money they saved by sacrificing my future. The act of releasing the pen was the easiest thing I had ever done. It was the release of a burden I was never meant to carry. I did not sign the restructuring agreement. I did not move my hand toward the empty signature line. Instead, I opened my fingers and let the pen drop. The heavy metal hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp, distinct click. The sound echoed in the silent conference room, cutting through the low hum of the air conditioning. The quiet noise shattered the illusion of my surrender. Helen frowned. Her polite maternal smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. Connor stopped leaning back. He sat up slightly, his smirk freezing as his brain tried to process the delay. Loan Officer Vance let out a short breath of annoyance. He was a busy corporate banker with a schedule to maintain. He likely assumed I was experiencing a momentary bout of anxiety before signing the ruinous contract. He did not know the anxiety in the room belonged entirely to the people sitting across from me. I ignored their stares. I leaned down and grasped the handles of my brown leather tote bag, resting on the floor. I lifted the bag and placed it firmly on the table. I pulled the zipper open. I reached inside and pulled out the massive dossier David Rossi and the fraud attorney had compiled over the past 4 days. It was not a single fragile sheet of paper. It was a thick, dense stack of documents bound by a heavy black clip and divided by brightly colored plastic tabs. It carried the substantial physical weight of undeniable evidence. I did not look at my parents. I did not seek their approval or fear their retaliation. I looked directly at Loan Officer Vance. I placed my hands on the thick stack of evidence and pushed it across the smooth table. The dossier glided over the mahogany and stopped right on top of his restructuring agreement, covering the blank signature line completely. I kept my voice perfectly level. I did not yell. I did not cry. I delivered the truth with the cold precision of a billing coordinator denying a fraudulent claim. I told Vance that I was not the guarantor. I told him my signature was forged using an illegal seal provided by the notary sitting at his table. The air in the room stopped moving. Vance looked from my face down to the thick stack of paper. He was a corporate officer trained to spot financial liability and protect his institution from loss. He reached out and opened the dossier to the first tab. He read the top page. It was the sworn federal identity theft affidavit bearing the official stamp of my certified public accountant. I watched his eyes track the lines of text. I watched the corporate irritation fade from his features, replaced by a profound, chilling shock. He turned the page to the second tab. He saw the certified Internet protocol logs proving the initial capital injection was executed from a residential router, while my employee punch card placed me miles away at the dental clinic. He turned to the third tab. He read the forensic handwriting analysis, detailing the specific discrepancies between my authentic signature and the crude forgery my father had created. He turned to the fourth tab. He saw the public employment records tying the notary public directly to my mother. Vance realized he was not sitting across from a supportive family trying to help a struggling business owner. He was sitting across from a criminal syndicate that had successfully defrauded a federal lending institution. He slowly lifted his head and looked at the people seated along the left side of the table. The dynamic in the room inverted entirely. The power shifted from the predators to the prey and then transferred directly to the institution they had tried to trick. Connor lost his smirk in real time. The smug, arrogant expression dissolved into raw, unadulterated panic. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen gray. He looked at the thick stack of papers under the loan officer's hands and realized his clean slate was gone. The consequences of his long history of failure were finally catching up to him, and he had no human shield left to hide behind. He had walked into the bank expecting a bailout, and he was now staring at a federal investigation. Helen broke the silence. The gracious project manager facade she had maintained for weeks crumbled into pieces. Her voice was shrill, desperate, and laced with genuine terror. She gasped my name and commanded me to stop it. She begged me to take the papers back. She was commanding me to rewind time and reinstate the silence she had relied on for 3 decades. but the paperwork was no longer mine to take back. It belonged to the bank. It belonged to the authorities. She reached her hand out as if she could physically snatch the truth out of the air, but her fingers grasped nothing. Thomas realized the physical evidence of his felony was sitting inches away from the loan officer. The passive cowardice that had defined his entire life gave way to a sudden frantic desperation. He lunged forward in his leather chair. He reached his hand across the mahogany table, attempting to grab the dossier before Vance could read any further or process the implications. He thought he could steal the evidence just as easily as he had stolen my inheritance. But Vance was faster. The loan officer pulled the documents close to his chest, moving them out of my father's reach. Vance did not say a single word to my parents. He did not ask them for an explanation or offer them a chance to defend themselves. The paperwork spoke for itself. It proved their guilt silently and indisputably. Vance reached under the edge of his heavy desk and pressed a discreet security button. The notary friend, the woman who had risked her state license and her freedom as a favor to Helen, realized the sheer gravity of the situation. She was an outsider to the family dynamic. She had no inherent loyalty to Connor or Thomas. She had stamped a document assuming the risk was zero, trusting my mother's assurance that I would simply fall in line. Seeing the public employment records tying her to the fraud was too much. The terror on her face was absolute. She pushed her heavy leather chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. She grabbed her purse, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the strap. She stood up, trying to distance herself from the unfolding catastrophe. She wanted to escape the blast radius before it consumed her, but the blast radius had already expanded to fill the entire conference room. The heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. A man in a dark suit entered the room. He did not carry a clipboard or a tablet. He carried a small notebook, and he wore an identification badge that clearly marked him as an internal bank fraud investigator. The presence of the investigator finalized the shift in power. The bank was no longer negotiating a debt settlement. The bank was securing evidence for a criminal referral. The trap my family had built for me had been rewired, and they were the ones caught in the steel jaws. I stood up from my chair. I did not answer my mother. I did not gloat over my brother's panic. I did not raise my voice to match the rising hysteria in the room. I simply reached down and picked up my empty brown leather tote bag. I slung the strap over my shoulder. I looked at the people who had stolen my inheritance, forged my name, and tried to saddle me with a lifetime of debt. I saw them exactly for what they were, small, selfish, and entirely broken by their own arrogance. I turned my back on them. I walked toward the heavy glass door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the quiet, thickly carpeted hallway. I left them sitting in the conference room, surrounded by the physical proof of their own crimes, trapped with the bank officers they had tried to deceive. I did not look back as the door clicked shut behind me. The drive back from the corporate park was the quietest 30 minutes of my life. I did not turn on the radio. I just listened to the steady hum of my tires against the pavement. The heavy brown leather bag was empty, left behind in the conference room. I had carried the burden into the building, and I had left it there. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the dental clinic just before my lunch break ended. Sarah was standing near the reception desk. She looked at my face, saw the calm, steady expression I wore, and smiled. She knew the storm had broken. My job was safe. My professional reputation remained untarnished. The clinic was my sanctuary once again. The fallout from that Friday morning did not happen quietly. The corporate machinery of Apex Commercial Lending operated with ruthless, unforgiving speed. They did not care about family optics or suburban reputations. They cared about recovering their capital. Within a week, the bank secured a court order. They seized the luxury auto detailing business. Tow trucks arrived at the commercial warehouse district and repossessed the expensive buffing equipment and the leased Porsche my brother drove. Padlocks were placed on the large garage bays, and legal notices were taped to the front office glass. Connor lost the business, the cars, and the carefully curated illusion of his success. When the liquidated business assets failed to cover the entire defaulted balance, the bank placed a lien on his suburban home. The golden child was forced to pack his belongings and leave the property he had tried to save by sacrificing my future. He was left with nothing but the ruin he had built himself. My parents faced a destruction of their own making. The internal fraud investigator at the bank did not keep the dossier internal. The evidence of forged signatures, illegal notary seals, and unauthorized wire transfers was handed directly to federal authorities. Thomas was formally indicted on charges of wire fraud and identity theft. He was forced to drain his remaining retirement accounts to hire a criminal defense attorney to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. The notary friend, the woman who had traded her professional integrity for a favor, was permanently stripped of her state license and faced legal peril of her own. The social exile my mother feared more than death became her daily reality. The federal indictment became public record. The Whisper Network in Somerset County works fast, and the truth is far more compelling than a fabricated story about a greedy sister. The extended family learned exactly what Thomas and Helen had done. The aunts and cousins who had glared at me during the bridal shower went dead silent. There were no more invitations to golf club luncheons or holiday gatherings. Helen was quietly asked to step down from her position on the local township planning board. My parents retreated into their large house, isolated by sheer, inescapable embarrassment. The community they had tried so hard to impress turned their backs on them. 2 months later, the fraud department at my personal bank concluded their investigation. They confirmed the initial wire transfer was executed illegally. The stolen $61,000 was fully insured, and the bank deposited the funds back into my high-yield savings account. I opened my banking application on my phone and stared at the restored balance. It was the exact amount my grandfather had intended for me. The money was clean, unencumbered, and finally mine again. That same evening, my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I looked at the screen. It was a text message from Thomas. It was a short, pathetic transmission from a man sitting in the wreckage of his own cowardice. He wrote, "I am sorry. Please call." There was no anger left in my chest. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a clear, unshakable boundary. Thomas was not sorry for stealing my inheritance. He was not sorry for trying to saddle me with $250,000 in fraudulent debt. He was only sorry that the accountant caught the anomaly. He was sorry the loan officer read the dossier. He was sorry he had been caught. He wanted to hear my voice to soothe his own guilt. I did not owe him absolution. I pressed the screen, deleted the message, and permanently blocked his number. The problem was resolved. The door was closed. A few weeks later, I stood in the bright sunlit hallway of the riverfront condo. Brenda, my real estate agent, stood next to me. She was beaming. The closing process had been smooth and uncomplicated. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a pair of brass keys on a simple metal ring. She placed them in the palm of my hand. The keys felt substantial. They were heavy with the promise of a life I had protected with my own 2 hands. I thanked Brenda, turned the key in the lock, and pushed the front door open. The living room was empty, smelling of fresh paint and clean hardwood. I walked across the floor, my footsteps echoing softly in the quiet space. I unlatched the glass patio doors and stepped out onto the small balcony. I held a mug of hot coffee in my hands. The morning sun was bright, reflecting off the slow-moving water of the Delaware River. A cool breeze moved through the trees lining the riverbank. There was no noise. There were no demands. There were no impossible expectations. I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked out at the water. My family had looked at my quiet discipline and mistaken it for weakness. They had assumed my silence meant I lacked the courage to fight back. They did not understand that I was never surrendering. My silence was simply the time I needed to load the weapon. They had priced my future at $61,000, but the paperwork I dropped on that mahogany table ended up costing them everything. If you have ever been the family safety net, the one expected to sacrifice your own stability to cover someone else's reckless choices, remember that you do not owe anyone your future. A boundary does not require a shouting match. It only requires the cold, undeniable truth. Drop the word receipts in the comments if you have ever had to prove your worth with paperwork. Thank you for listening. Subscribe to Blueberry Revenge for more stories, and I will see you in the next one.